Elias Mercer never imagined his wedding day would involve a loaded gun pressed against his spine, a woman he'd met 5 minutes earlier reciting vows through clenched teeth, and a wagon master who looked ready to shoot them both if the ceremony didn't finish fast. The preacher's hands shook as he mumbled the final words. Somewhere in the chaos of that moment, standing in ankle-deep mud outside a ramshackle trading post with his new bride's fingers digging into his arm like iron claws, Elias understood with perfect, terrifying clarity that his carefully planned future had just shattered into 1,000 pieces, and the woman beside him held every single one. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button and comment with your city below so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The stagecoach that brought Elias Mercer to the edge of civilization smelled like sweat, old leather, and broken dreams. For 3 weeks, he had endured cramped quarters, rutted roads, and the increasingly skeptical stares of his fellow passengers, men with calloused hands and sun-darkened faces who sized him up with a single glance and found him wanting. Elias pretended not to notice. He kept his nose in his medical journals, his thin fingers tracing diagrams of molars and bicuspids, his mind filled with visions of a clean, orderly practice where frontier families would line up gratefully for his services. Boston seemed like another lifetime now. The neat brownstone where he'd studied, the gas lamps that lined Commonwealth Avenue, the predictable rhythm of a world that made sense, all of it had faded into memory. His father had called him a fool for leaving. His colleagues at the dental college had laughed outright when he'd announced his plans to head west. But Elias had held firm. The frontier needed educated men, civilized men who could bring order and progress to the wild territories. He would be that man. The stagecoach lurched to a halt outside a settlement that barely deserved the name. A dozen weathered buildings slouched along a muddy main street, their false fronts painted with faded promises of goods and services. Elias stepped down carefully, trying to keep his polished boots out of the worst of the muck, and immediately felt the weight of curious eyes upon him. "End of the line, friend," the driver called down, already unstrapping Elias's trunk from the roof. "Holloway Station, such as it is." Elias adjusted his spectacles and surveyed his new home with what he hoped looked like confidence rather than creeping dread. The sun hung low and angry on the horizon, painting everything in shades of rust and shadow. A handful of rough-looking men loitered outside what appeared to be a saloon, their conversation dying as they turned to study the newcomer. Elias felt his stomach tighten but forced himself to stand straight, to project the authority his education had supposedly granted him. "Dr. Elias Mercer," he said to no one in particular, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the open air. "I'm here to establish a dental practice. Perhaps you could direct me to—" "Dentist?" One of the men spat into the dirt and grinned, revealing gaps where teeth should have been. "Hell, boy, we got about as much use for a tooth puller as we do for a ballet dancer." The others laughed, harsh and mocking. Elias felt heat creep up his neck but maintained his composure. This was to be expected. Frontiermen were naturally suspicious of outsiders, of education, of anything that smacked of Eastern refinement. He would win them over with patience and professionalism. "Nevertheless," Elias continued, clutching his medical bag tighter, "I intend to serve this community to the best of my abilities. Now, if someone could recommend lodgings and perhaps help me transport my equipment, I can help you with that, friend." The voice came from behind him, smooth and friendly. Elias turned to find a well-dressed man approaching, his suit only slightly dusty, his smile wide and welcoming. He stuck out his hand. "Name's Clayton Fisk. I run the trading post here, among other enterprises. Always pleased to meet an educated gentleman." His handshake was firm, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Dental practice, you say? Well now, that's forward thinking. This town could use a touch of civilization." Elias felt relief wash over him. Finally, someone who understood. "Mr. Fisk, I'm delighted to make your acquaintance. Yes, I have my equipment, my credentials from the Boston College of Dental Surgery, and capital enough to establish a proper office. I was hoping to—" "Say no more." Fisk clapped him on the shoulder like they were old friends. "I know exactly what you need. Happens I've got a prime piece of property right on the main street, perfect for a medical office. And I can arrange transport for all your goods, get you set up proper. For a reasonable fee, of course." "Of course," Elias agreed, too grateful to be cautious. "That would be most appreciated." Now, you'll be needing a wagon to haul that trunk and all your equipment, I expect. And horses. Can't get anywhere out here without good horses. I've got both, and I can let you have them at a fair price. Cash on the barrel, naturally. Can't extend credit to folks I don't know yet, you understand. Elias hesitated. He'd budgeted carefully for his journey west, but his funds were not unlimited. Still, what choice did he have? He was stranded in the middle of nowhere with a trunk full of dental instruments and no means of transport. How much? He asked. Fisk named a figure that made Elias's eyes widen. That seems rather steep, Mr. Fisk. In Boston, I could purchase— This ain't Boston, friend. Fisk's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Out here, things cost what they cost. Supply and demand, you understand. You're welcome to shop around, of course, but I'm the only game in town when it comes to reliable transport. 30 minutes later, Elias stood beside a wagon that looked ready to collapse, hitched to a horse so sway-backed and weary it could barely lift its head. His carefully saved capital had been reduced by more than half, and a sick feeling was growing in the pit of his stomach that he'd been thoroughly swindled. She's a good wagon, Fisk assured him, pocketing Elias's money with practiced ease. And that horse has plenty of miles left in her. You just treat her right, she'll get you where you need to go. Where exactly is the property you mentioned? Elias asked weakly. The one suitable for my practice? Ah. Fisk's expression turned regretful. Well now, I may have spoken too soon on that count. Turns out that space got rented out just this morning. Terrible timing. But I'm sure something else will open up soon enough. In the meantime, you can stable that wagon behind my trading post. Only cost you $1 a week. Elias stared at him, understanding dawning with horrible clarity. He'd been played for a fool, cheated by the first friendly face he'd encountered, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. The men outside the saloon were watching the whole exchange with undisguised amusement. I see, Elias said quietly. Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Fisk. He turned away before the man could see the humiliation burning in his face, grabbed the horse's lead rope, and began walking down the muddy street with no clear destination in mind. Behind him, he heard laughter. Not cruel exactly, but not kind either. The laughter of men who'd seen this scene play out 100 times before. Another soft Easterner learning hard lessons about the frontier. The horse followed reluctantly, the wagon creaking and groaning with every turn of its wheels. Elias's boots were now thoroughly caked with mud, and he could feel blisters forming where the stiff leather rubbed against his heels. The sun was setting fast, painting the ramshackle buildings in shades of blood and fire, and he had nowhere to sleep, no prospects, and rapidly dwindling resources. This was not how it was supposed to go. He found a spot near the edge of town where the street gave way to open prairie, unhitched the miserable horse, and sat down on the wagon's tailgate. His medical bag rested beside him, filled with gleaming instruments that now seemed absurdly optimistic. What had he been thinking? That the frontier was just waiting for someone like him, someone educated and refined, to come along and civilize it. The West didn't want civilization. It wanted survival, toughness, the ability to thrive in a place that chewed up weak men and spat out their bones. You look about as lost as a man can get. Elias looked up sharply. A woman stood a few feet away, watching him with an expression somewhere between curiosity and amusement. She was perhaps 30, lean and weathered in a way that spoke of hard living, dressed in trail-worn clothes that had once been finer than they currently appeared. Her hair was dark, pulled back in a practical braid, and her eyes were the kind of sharp that missed nothing. I'm fine, thank you, Elias said automatically, then winced at how absurd that must sound. The woman snorted. Sure you are. That why you're sitting in the dirt looking like someone just stole your last dollar? Several of my last dollars, actually, Elias muttered. Let me guess. Clayton Fisk? Elias nodded miserably. He's got a talent for spotting greenhorns. She moved closer, her boots making no sound in the soft earth, and studied him with unsettling directness. You're the dentist everyone's talking about. The one who came all the way from Boston to pull teeth for cowboys. I came to establish a respectable practice, Elias corrected, then immediately felt foolish for bothering. What did it matter what this stranger thought? Respectable. The woman repeated the word like it was foreign. Well, Dr. Mercer, I'm afraid you've wandered into the wrong place for that particular ambition. So I'm beginning to understand. She was quiet for a moment, still watching him with those unsettling eyes. Then she seemed to come to some kind of decision. I need a husband. Elias blinked. I beg your pardon? Not a real one, she clarified quickly. Just the appearance of one. There's a wagon train forming up, heading deeper into the territories. I need to be on it, but they won't take unmarried women. Too much trouble, they say. Bad for morale. So I need a husband's name and a husband's presence, at least until we reach the next settlement. You're proposing marriage? Elias asked incredulously. To me? You don't even know me. I know enough. You're desperate, broke, and you've got nowhere else to go. I can see it written all over your face. She crossed her arms. I'm offering you a way out of this mud hole and a chance to reach a bigger settlement where you might actually find people who need a dentist. All you have to do is stand beside me for a few minutes while a preacher says words, then keep your mouth shut on the trail. When we reach Fort Collins, we go our separate ways. Simple. That's fraud, Elias said weakly. That's survival. She took a step closer. Look around, Dr. Mercer. This place is dying. Another few months and there won't be anything here but ghosts and Clayton Fisk. That wagon train is your best shot at reaching somewhere with an actual future. You going to let your Eastern morals keep you trapped here? Elias wanted to say yes, wanted to insist that he would make his own way through honest means and proper channels, but the truth was staring him in the face. He was already defeated, already drowning, and this strange, hard-eyed woman was throwing him a rope. It might be frayed and questionable, but it was the only rope in sight. What's your name? He asked. Vera Kane. Why do you need to be on that wagon train, Miss Kane? Something flickered across her face. Wariness, maybe, or calculation. My reasons are my own. That's part of the deal. You don't ask questions, I don't ask questions. We both get what we need. It was madness, absolute madness. But then, coming west in the first place had been madness, and marrying a stranger couldn't possibly make his situation worse than it already was. All right, Elias heard himself say. All right, I'll do it. Vera nodded once, sharp and satisfied. Good. The wagon train leaves at dawn. We need to be married before then. She glanced at the sky where the last light was fading fast. That gives us about 2 hours to find a preacher and make this legal. 2 hours? Elias stood up, his legs unsteady. That's impossible. We need a license, witnesses, proper... We need a preacher who's drunk enough not to ask too many questions, and a wagon master who's willing to overlook the fact that this marriage is fresher than milk. Vera was already moving, her stride long and purposeful. Come on, Dr. Mercer. Time to see if you've got any spine under all that education. Elias grabbed his medical bag and hurried after her, the decrepit horse and wagon forgotten behind him. His heart was hammering against his ribs, his mind screaming that this was wrong, that he should stop, that he should think things through properly. But his feet kept moving, following this strange woman through the darkening streets of Holloway Station toward a future he couldn't begin to imagine. They found the preacher in the back room of the saloon, exactly as drunk as Vera had predicted. He was a small, nervous man with trembling hands and the look of someone who'd fled to the frontier to escape his past. When Vera explained what she needed, he started to protest about propriety and legal requirements, but a handful of coins changed his mind quickly enough. We'll do it outside, Vera said. The wagon master needs to witness it. That's Samuel Garrett. He's particular about his trains. Won't take anyone he doesn't trust. So you're going to smile, Dr. Mercer, and you're going to look like a man who's marrying the woman he loves. Think you can manage that? Elias swallowed hard. I'll try. Don't try. Do it. Our lives might depend on it. That statement should have alarmed him more than it did, but Elias was already so far beyond alarm that it barely registered. He followed Vera and the preacher out into the street, where full darkness had now fallen. Lanterns hung outside the trading post, casting pools of yellow light across the mud. A crowd had gathered. Word traveled fast in small towns, and apparently nothing was more entertaining than watching two strangers get married in the middle of the night. Standing at the center of the crowd was a man who could only be Samuel Garrett. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. He looked Vera up and down, then turned the same assessing gaze on Elias. This your man? Garrett asked. This is my husband, Vera said firmly, linking her arm through Elias's with surprising strength. Elias Mercer. We're newlyweds, practically. Just making it official before we join your train. Garrett's expression didn't change. Uh-huh. And where exactly did you two lovebirds meet? Boston, Elias blurted out, then immediately realized his mistake when Vera's fingers dug into his arm like talons. I mean, we met in Boston originally, but we reconnected here, and it seemed like fate. So we decided not to waste time, Vera cut in smoothly. Life's too short, and the frontier's too dangerous. We want to build a future together, Mr. Garrett, and we'd be grateful for the chance to travel with your train. My husband's a dentist. Educated man. That's got to count for something. Garrett looked between them for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he spat into the dirt. I don't give a damn if he's the King of England. What I care about is whether you'll cause trouble on my train. I run a tight outfit, and I don't tolerate nonsense. You understand me? Perfectly, Vera said. Then let's get this done. Garrett gestured to the preacher, who stumbled forward with a tattered Bible clutched in his shaking hands. The ceremony that followed was the strangest few minutes of Elias's life. The preacher mumbled through the vows so quickly that half the words were unintelligible. Vera's hand was rigid in his, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on some point over the preacher's shoulder. Elias tried to remember Vera's advice about smiling like a man in love, but his face felt frozen, his whole body tense with the surreal wrongness of the situation. And then, just as the preacher reached the part about speaking now or forever holding your peace, Elias felt something hard press against the small of his back. He went absolutely still. Keep smiling, Vera murmured, her voice so low only he could hear it. Don't turn around, don't make a sound, just finish the vows. The pressure of this gun, because it was definitely a gun, there was no mistaking that particular sensation, remained constant against his spine. Elias's vision started to blur at the edges. This was it. This was where his grand frontier adventure ended, shot in the back during a fake wedding ceremony in a town whose name he could barely remember. Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? The preacher wheezed. I do, Elias whispered. And do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do, Vera said, her voice steady as stone. Then, by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the— That won't be necessary, Vera said quickly. She turned to Garrett, all business. We're official now. We'll be ready to move out at dawn. Garrett nodded slowly, still watching them with that penetrating stare. See that you are. And Mrs. Mercer? He waited until Vera met his eyes. I don't know what game you're playing, but you better pray I don't figure it out before we reach Fort Collins. Clear? Crystal, Vera said. The gun against Elias's back disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. He didn't dare turn around, didn't dare do anything but stand there while Vera pulled him away from the crowd, away from the light, back toward the darkness at the edge of town. His legs were shaking so badly he could barely walk. What the hell was that? He hissed once they were alone. Who? Keep walking. Vera's grip on his arm was iron hard. Don't look back. Don't ask questions. Just keep moving. They reached his wagon, still sitting where he'd left it, the exhausted horse dozing in its traces. Vera finally released him and turned to face him fully for the first time since the ceremony. Listen carefully, Dr. Mercer, because I'm only going to explain this once. There are people in this town who don't want me leaving. Dangerous people. That gun at your back was a warning. To me, not you. They're letting me know they're watching, that they could end this anytime they want. But they won't. Not as long as I play by their rules. What rules? Elias demanded, his fear turning to anger. What have you gotten me into? Survival, Vera said flatly. I told you that already. Now here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow morning, we join that wagon train. You drive this pathetic excuse for a wagon, you keep your mouth shut, and you don't do anything to make Garrett suspicious. In return, I get you safely to Fort Collins, where you can set up your precious dental practice and forget this ever happened. That's the deal. The deal didn't include guns and death threats. The deal included whatever it took to get on that train. Vera's eyes were hard as flint in the moonlight. And if you're smart, you'll realize that running away right now would be the stupidest thing you could possibly do. Those people who are watching us, they're still watching. You try to back out now and we're both dead before sunrise. Elias felt ice slide down his spine. You're serious? As a grave, Dr. Mercer. She moved closer, her voice dropping even lower. I know you're scared. I know this isn't what you signed up for, but you're in it now, whether you like it or not. So you can either collapse in a heap and wait to die, or you can grow a spine and survive. Your choice. He wanted to protest, to argue, to demand answers to the 1,000 questions burning in his mind. But looking into Vera's eyes, he knew none of it would matter. She told him the truth from the beginning. This was about survival, nothing more and nothing less. And Elias, for all his education and breeding, had just learned the hardest lesson the frontier had to teach. Out here, survival meant doing things that would have been unthinkable back in Boston. All right, he said quietly, I'll play my part. But when we reach Fort Collins, you never see me again, Vera finished. Trust me, Dr. Mercer, that will suit us both just fine. She turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows without another word, leaving Elias alone with his decrepit wagon, his shattered illusions, and a wedding ring he didn't remember receiving. He looked down at his left hand and found a simple gold band on his fourth finger, dull and scratched, but undeniably real. He was married. To a woman he didn't know, who had secrets dangerous enough to get them both killed. And tomorrow, at dawn, he would climb into this wagon and head deeper into the wilderness, further from everything safe and familiar, tied to a stranger by vows spoken at gunpoint. Elias sat down on the tailgate again and dropped his head into his hands. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, long and mournful. The sound echoed across the empty prairie, carrying with it all the loneliness and danger of this vast, unforgiving land. He'd wanted adventure. He'd wanted to prove himself on the frontier, to show everyone back in Boston that he was more than just a soft-handed academic. Well, the frontier was giving him exactly what he'd asked for. The question was whether he'd survive it. Dawn came too quickly, pale and cold, turning the eastern sky from black to gray to reluctant gold. Elias hadn't slept. He'd spent the night sitting in the wagon bed, watching the stars wheel overhead, trying to convince himself that the previous evening had been some kind of fever dream. But the ring on his finger was real enough, and when the first wagons began assembling in the muddy street, Vera appeared out of nowhere and climbed onto the seat beside him without a word of greeting. You look terrible, she observed. I didn't sleep. Get used to it. We've got weeks of travel ahead. She took the reins from his limp hands and made a clicking sound at the exhausted horse, which lifted its head with visible reluctance. Stay close to the wagon ahead of us and don't fall behind. Garrett abandoned stragglers. The wagon train was larger than Elias had expected, 23 wagons in all, carrying families, merchants, prospectors, and others whose stories he could only guess at. Children ran between the wheels, their excited voices cutting through the morning quiet. Women organized supplies and called instructions to their husbands. Men checked harnesses, loaded rifles, and cast measuring glances at the sky. Samuel Garrett rode up and down the line on a big bay horse, shouting orders and making adjustments to the formation. When he passed Elias and Vera's wagon, he paused long enough to fix them both with that penetrating stare. Keep up, was all he said before moving on. The train lurched into motion with the agonizing slowness of a creature waking from hibernation. Wheels creaked, horses strained, and gradually the whole ungainly procession began rolling westward, leaving Holloway Station behind in a cloud of dust and diminishing hope. Elias gripped the side of the wagon and watched the settlement shrink behind them. Despite everything, the cheating, the humiliation, the terror of the previous night, part of him wanted to jump down and run back to that miserable collection of buildings. At least there he'd understood the rules, understood what he was up against. Out here, rolling into the unknown with a wife who carried secrets and a wagon master who trusted no one, Elias had no idea what was coming. Stop looking back, Vera said without turning her head. Nothing behind us but ghosts. What's ahead of us? Elias asked. Vera's jaw tightened. Trouble, Dr. Mercer, more trouble than you can possibly imagine. The wagon rolled on, carrying them both toward a future neither had chosen, but both were now irrevocably tied to. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the horizon where the prairie met the sky, that trouble was waiting. The first 3 days on the trail passed in a blur of dust, creaking wheels, and Elias's growing certainty that he would die out here in some humiliating fashion that would confirm every doubt his father had ever voiced about his competence. The wagon lurched over ruts and rocks with bone-jarring regularity. His hands blistered despite the gloves Vera had thrust at him without comment. The sun beat down with relentless fury, and at night the temperature dropped so sharply that his teeth chattered despite the blankets. Vera drove most of the time, her hands steady on the reins, her face revealing nothing. She spoke only when necessary, offering terse instructions about water rationing, where to make camp, and which families in the train to avoid. Elias had tried asking questions that first day, about her past, about the people who'd threatened them, about what exactly she was running from, but her silence had been so absolute and so clearly deliberate that he'd eventually given up. They slept on opposite sides of the wagon at night, a careful distance maintained between them. The other families assumed they were newlyweds still finding their rhythm, and Vera did nothing to correct that impression. She played the part of a modest frontier wife with unsettling skill, lowering her eyes when other men addressed her, staying close to Elias during the evening gatherings around the central fire, even touching his arm occasionally in a pantomime of affection that made his skin crawl with its calculated coldness. On the fourth morning, everything changed. Elias woke to shouting. He scrambled out from under his blanket, his heart hammering, and found the camp in chaos. Men were running toward the eastern perimeter, rifles in hand. Women gathered children close, faces tight with fear. Samuel Garrett's voice rose above the confusion, sharp with command. "Form up! Get those wagons circled! Move!" Vera was already on her feet, her expression alert but not surprised. That lack of surprise bothered Elias more than the panic around them. "What's happening?" he demanded. "Raiders, probably. Or bandits. Could be nothing." She was checking something in her saddlebag. Her movements quick and efficient. "Stay with the wagon. Don't do anything stupid." "What are you—" But she was already moving, threading through the chaos toward where Garrett and his scouts had gathered. Elias stood frozen for a moment, torn between following her and obeying her instruction. Then a woman's scream cut through the morning air, high and terrified, and his body made the decision for him. He ran toward the sound. The eastern edge of the camp bordered a shallow ravine, and that's where he found them. A group of 5 men on horseback, rough and mean-looking, facing down Garrett and a handful of armed settlers. The lead rider was grinning, showing gaps in his teeth, a rifle resting casually across his saddle. "Now, we don't want trouble," the man was saying, his voice carrying a false friendliness that fooled no one. "We're just poor travelers who've run low on supplies. Thought maybe you fine folks could spare some provisions? Neighborly-like." "You're not neighbors," Garrett said flatly. "You're thieves, and you've got about 10 seconds to turn those horses around before we put holes in you." The grinning man's expression didn't change, but something dark flickered in his eyes. "That's unfriendly talk, especially when we've got the advantage of position." He gestured with his rifle toward the ravine, and Elias saw with sinking dread that more riders were emerging from the far side, at least a dozen, maybe more. They'd been outflanked. Garrett saw it too. His jaw tightened, but his rifle never wavered. "You can have food, water. Then you leave. That's the deal." "Oh, I think we'll be taking more than that." The leader's grin widened. "See those wagons back there? Some of them look mighty prosperous. Hate to think what kind of valuables might be hidden inside. And those women—" He never finished the sentence. The shot came from somewhere behind Elias, the crack of a rifle splitting the air. The leader jerked in his saddle, his hat flying off, a line of red appearing across his temple. Not a killing shot, but close enough to make the point. Chaos erupted. The raiders reached for their weapons. The settlers opened fire. Horses screamed and reared. Elias stood paralyzed in the middle of it all, his medical training screaming at him to find cover while his body refused to cooperate. He watched in frozen horror as one of the raiders swung his rifle toward Garrett, finger tightening on the trigger. Then someone slammed into Elias from behind, knocking him sideways into the dirt. A bullet whined through the space where he'd been standing, so close he felt the displacement of air. He hit the ground hard, his glasses flying off, the world dissolving into a blur of movement and noise. "Stay down!" Vera's voice sharp and furious in his ear. She was on top of him, shielding his body with hers, and in her hand was a rifle he'd never seen before. She fired twice in quick succession, the reports deafening, then rolled off him and took cover behind a wagon wheel. "Crawl! Get to the wagons!" Elias's hand scrabbled in the dirt for his glasses. His fingers closed around them, miraculously unbroken, and he shoved them back on his face. The scene snapped into terrible clarity. 2 raiders were down, writhing in the dust. The rest had scattered, seeking cover in the rocks and scrub. The settlers were firing from behind wagons, a ragged but determined defense, and Vera was in the middle of it, her rifle moving with practiced efficiency, firing and reloading with movements so smooth they looked almost casual. Elias crawled. His knees scraped raw against the rocky ground, his breath coming in panicked gasps, but he moved. A bullet kicked up dirt inches from his hand. Another splintered wood from a wagon just above his head. Somehow he reached the dubious shelter of an overturned water barrel and pressed himself against it, making himself as small as possible. The firefight lasted perhaps 3 minutes. To Elias, it felt like hours. When the shooting finally stopped, the morning air was thick with gun smoke and the smell of blood. 3 raiders lay dead in the dust. The others had retreated, vanishing back into the ravine as quickly as they had appeared. On the settlers' side, 2 men were wounded, one with a bullet through the shoulder, another with a gash across his ribs where a shot had come too close. Elias's medical training finally overcame his terror. He staggered to his feet and ran toward the wounded, his bag forgotten back at his own wagon, but his knowledge intact. The man with the shoulder wound was named Peters, a quiet farmer from Ohio. He was conscious, his face pale and slick with sweat, his hand pressed uselessly against the bleeding wound. "Let me see," Elias said, his voice shaking but his hands surprisingly steady as he eased Peters down. "I'm a doctor. Well, a dentist, but I know anatomy. I can help." "Not much help without your instruments," someone muttered behind him. "Then get them," Elias snapped, not looking up. "Black bag in the wagon with the broken wheel cover. Hurry!" To his surprise, the man ran. Elias focused on Peters, examining the wound with fingers that barely trembled. The bullet had gone clean through, missing the bone and major vessels. Lucky. Incredibly lucky, but the wound needed to be cleaned and packed or infection would kill the man just as surely as the bullet might have. Someone thrust his medical bag into his hands. Elias worked quickly, cleaning the wound with precious water, packing it with clean cloth torn from his own shirt. Peters gritted his teeth and bore it in silence, which Elias appreciated. The other wounded man was in better shape, his injury superficial, and Elias patched him up with less urgency. When he finally stood, his hands bloody and his shirt ruined, he found half the camp staring at him. "That was good work, Doc," Garrett said gruffly. He was reloading his rifle, his face grim. "Quick thinking." Elias nodded, not trusting his voice. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him shaky and slightly nauseous. He looked around for Vera and found her standing apart from the others, her rifle now slung casually over her shoulder, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. "That shot that started it all," one of the settlers was saying, a note of awe in his voice. "The one that creased that bastard's skull and knocked his hat clean off. Hell of a shot. Who made it?" Silence fell. Eyes turned, searching, finally settling on Elias. "Was that you, Doc?" Garrett asked slowly. Elias opened his mouth to deny it, to explain that he'd never fired a rifle in his life, that he'd been standing there like a fool when the shooting started. But before he could speak, Vera stepped forward. "It was him," she said clearly. "My husband. I saw him take the shot." "The hell you say?" Garrett breathed. "That was at least 70 yards, moving target, high wind? That's not luck. That's skill." "He doesn't like to brag," Vera continued smoothly, moving to stand beside Elias. Her hand found his, squeezing hard enough to make his bones creak. A warning. "But yes, he knows his way around a rifle. Among his other talents." Elias stared at her, his mind reeling. Why was she lying? What possible reason? Then he saw it. The way the men were looking at him now, with something that might have been respect. The way Garrett's expression had shifted from dismissive tolerance to genuine interest. The way even Peters, lying wounded on the ground, was nodding his thanks with a new kind of appreciation in his eyes. They thought he was a hero. They thought he'd saved them with a single, perfect shot. And Vera, for reasons he couldn't begin to understand, wanted them to believe it. "I did what needed doing," Elias heard himself say, the lie sitting heavy in his mouth. "Nothing more." Garrett clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to make him stagger. Modest, too. Hell, Doc, you might just be exactly what this train needs. A man who can heal and fight. That's rare out here. The other men were nodding, murmuring agreement. Elias felt the weight of their faith settling on his shoulders like a physical thing. He wanted to shrug it off, to tell the truth, but Vera's hand was still crushing his, and her eyes were boring into him with fierce intensity. "We should move," she said to Garrett, her voice all business. "Those raiders might come back with reinforcements. We're too exposed here." Agreed. Garrett started shouting orders, and the camp erupted into organized chaos as people rushed to pack up and reform the wagon line. Vera pulled Elias away from the crowd, back toward their wagon, her grip on his arm bruising. "What the hell were you thinking?" he hissed as soon as they were out of earshot. "Why did you lie?" "I didn't lie. I just didn't correct their assumption." "You told them I made that shot. I've never even held a rifle." "And now they think you have." Vera released him and started checking the wagon, making sure nothing had been damaged or stolen in the chaos. "Trust me, that's better for both of us." "How is lying better? When they find out, they won't find out, unless you're stupid enough to tell them." She turned to face him fully, her expression hard. "Listen to me, Dr. Mercer. Out here, reputation is everything. Those men respect you now. They'll protect you, include you, trust you. That makes both of us safer. Do you understand?" "No," Elias said honestly. "I don't understand any of this. I don't understand why you needed to be on this train so badly. I don't understand why you have a rifle or how you know how to use it like a professional soldier. I don't understand why people were threatening us in Holloway Station or what you're running from, and I especially don't understand why you just painted a target on my back by making these people think I'm something I'm not." Vera was quiet for a moment, studying him. Then she sighed, a sound of pure frustration. "You want the truth? Fine. I'm hunting someone. Someone very dangerous who's traveling with this wagon train. Someone who's transporting illegal weapons that could start a war and get a lot of innocent people killed. I needed to be here to stop them, and I couldn't do that if Garrett refused to let me join, so I used you. And that shot, the real one, the one I made, bought us both credibility we didn't have before. Now they think your wife is married to a hero, which means they won't look too closely at what she's really doing." Elias felt cold despite the morning heat. "Weapons? What kind of weapons?" "Rifles. 50 crates of them, hidden somewhere in these wagons, being smuggled to hostile tribes who will use them to attack settlements, kill families, destroy everything in their path. My job is to find those weapons and stop the shipment before it reaches its destination." "Your job?" Elias repeated. "Who exactly do you work for?" Vera's jaw tightened. "People who want to keep the frontier from exploding into all-out war. That's all you need to know. And the person you're hunting, the one with the weapons? I don't know who they are yet, that's the problem. They could be anyone in this train. That merchant with the 3 wagons, that quiet family from Pennsylvania. Hell, it could be Garrett himself, though I doubt it. Whoever they are, they're good, professional. They've covered their tracks well." Elias's mind was racing, trying to process this flood of information. And those raiders this morning, were they connected? Maybe. Probably. Could have been a distraction or a first attempt to hijack the weapons. Or they could have been exactly what they looked like, opportunistic thieves. Vera shook her head. "That's what makes this so damn difficult. Out here, everyone's a threat until proven otherwise. You should have told me this from the beginning. Would you have agreed to marry me if I had?" Elias opened his mouth, then closed it. She had a point. Garrett's voice rang out across the camp. "We're moving in 5 minutes. Anyone not ready gets left behind." Vera climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins. "Get in, Dr. Mercer, and from now on try to look like a man who knows how to handle a gun. Our lives might depend on it." Elias climbed up beside her, his mind still reeling. As the wagon lurched into motion, joining the line of vehicles rolling westward, he looked back at the blood-stained ground where the fight had happened. 3 men dead, 2 wounded, and everyone convinced that he, Elias Mercer, timid dentist from Boston, had fired the shot that saved them all. The weight of that lie was going to crush him. He could feel it already, pressing down on his chest until he could barely breathe. But what choice did he have now? He was trapped in this deception as surely as he was trapped in this marriage. and somewhere in the wagons rolling ahead of them, someone was carrying weapons that could kill hundreds, maybe thousands. The frontier, Elias thought grimly, was turning out to be even more dangerous than he'd feared. The wagon train pushed west through country that grew steadily rougher and more unforgiving. The rolling prairie gave way to broken hills and rocky ravines where wagon wheels cracked against hidden stones and axles groaned under the strain. Water became scarcer. The dust thickened until it coated everything: skin, clothes, food. Tempers grew short as the journey wore on. Elias found himself thrust into a role he'd never auditioned for. The other men began seeking him out during the evening stops, asking his opinion on matters of safety and defense. They assumed he had military experience, frontier knowledge, skills he absolutely did not possess. He deflected when he could, gave vague answers when he couldn't, and felt the lie growing bigger with each passing day. Peters, the man whose shoulder he'd treated, recovered well. He told everyone who would listen about the dentist, who could shoot like a marksman and doctor like a surgeon. The story spread, gaining embellishments with each retelling. By the end of the first week, Elias had supposedly killed 2 of the raiders single-handedly and saved 5 men from bleeding to death. "You're becoming a legend," Vera observed one night as they made camp. There was dry amusement in her voice, but also something darker. "Be careful. Legends have a way of getting themselves killed when they can't live up to expectations." "This was your idea," Elias reminded her bitterly. He was exhausted, covered in dust, and his hands ached from wrestling the stubborn wagon all day. "You're the one who started this. I gave you credibility. You're the one who keeps feeding it." She nodded toward where a group of men sat around the evening fire, talking in low voices. "They're planning a hunting party for tomorrow. They want you to lead it." "Absolutely not. You don't have a choice. If you refuse, they'll wonder why. They'll start asking questions." Vera's eyes were sharp in the firelight. "You need to go. You need to miss every shot you take and blame it on bad luck or poor conditions. You need to stay just competent enough to maintain the illusion without actually having to prove anything." "I hate this," Elias said quietly. "I know." For the first time, Vera's expression softened slightly. "For what it's worth, you're handling it better than I expected. Most men would have cracked by now. Most men wouldn't have gotten themselves into this situation in the first place." "No," Vera agreed. "Most men wouldn't have. But then most men don't have the courage to admit when they're in over their heads. You do. That's worth something." The hunting party the next day was exactly as disastrous as Elias had feared. 5 men, including himself, riding out into the hills in search of deer or antelope to supplement the train's dwindling supplies. Elias had been handed a rifle, a heavy, unfamiliar weapon that he held like it might explode at any moment. The other men gave him pointers he pretended to already know, showed him techniques he nodded along with while understanding nothing. When they finally spotted a small herd of antelope, Elias deliberately aimed wide and high. His shot went nowhere near the animals, which bounded away into the rocks. The other men shook their heads sympathetically. "Bad angle," one of them said. "Next time." There was no next time, though. They returned to camp empty-handed, and Elias weathered the good-natured ribbing with what he hoped looked like good humor. Inside, he was shaking with relief. He'd survived another test, maintained the deception for one more day. But Vera was right. The lie was growing too big, developing a weight and momentum of its own. Sooner or later, it would demand more than he could give. That moment came sooner than he expected. They were 12 days into the journey when the scouts reported smoke on the horizon. Garrett called a halt and rode out with 2 men to investigate. They returned an hour later, their faces grim. "Settlement," Garrett announced to the gathered train, "or what's left of one. Burned to the ground. Looks recent, maybe 2 days old." A murmur of fear rippled through the crowd. Women pulled children closer. Men checked their weapons. "Raiders?" someone asked. "Can't tell. Could be raiders, could be something else." Garrett's jaw was set. "We need to know what we're heading into. I'm taking a small group to search the ruins, see if there are any survivors, any clues about what happened. I need men who can handle themselves. Doc, you're with me." Elias's stomach dropped. "I should stay with the wounded, in case—" "Peters is fine. We need you for this." Garrett's tone left no room for argument. "You, Collins, Morrison, and Hayes. We leave in 10 minutes." Vera caught Elias's arm as he stumbled back toward their wagon. "You'll be fine," she said quietly. "Just keep your head down and don't volunteer for anything. Observe, follow orders, come back alive. What if there's trouble? Then you run. You're not a hero, Elias, remember that. Heroes get killed." The ride to the settlement was tense and silent. The 5 men moved in tight formation, rifles ready, eyes scanning the rocky hills for any sign of threat. The smoke grew thicker as they approached, dark and oily against the pale sky. What they found was worse than Elias could have imagined. The settlement had been small, maybe 10 buildings clustered around a central well. Now it was nothing but charred timber and ash. Bodies lay in the street, black and twisted. The smell was overwhelming, a thick corruption that made Elias gag and press his sleeve over his mouth and nose. "Spread out," Garrett ordered quietly. "Look for survivors. Be careful. Whoever did this might still be close." They moved through the ruins in shocked silence. Elias found himself drawn toward what had been a small house, now just foundation stones and collapsed beams. His foot kicked something in the ash, a child's toy, a wooden horse with one wheel missing. He stared at it for a long moment, his throat tight. "Doc! Over here!" The shout came from Morrison, near the far edge of the settlement. Elias ran, his heart pounding, and found the man kneeling beside what looked like a root cellar. The door had been torn away, and inside— "There's someone down there," Morrison said urgently. "Can't tell if they're alive." Elias climbed down into the cellar, the darkness closing around him like a fist. At the bottom, huddled in the corner, was a girl. Maybe 14, her clothes torn and filthy, her face streaked with soot and tears. When Elias reached for her, she flinched violently. "It's all right," he said softly, the same tone he'd used with frightened patients back in Boston. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Elias. We're here to help." She stared at him with eyes too old for her face. Then slowly she reached out and took his hand. Getting her out of the cellar, onto a horse, back to the wagon train, it all happened in a blur. Elias was aware only of the girl's trembling form pressed against his back as they rode, her arms locked around his waist like iron bands. She didn't speak, didn't make a sound. When they reached the train, the women took over immediately, pulling the girl into their circle, wrapping her in blankets, offering water and soft words. Elias stood apart, his hands shaking now that the crisis had passed. Garrett approached him, his expression unreadable. "Good work back there, Doc. That girl might be the only survivor. If you hadn't found her, anyone would have done the same," Elias said quietly. "Maybe. But you were the one who did it." Garrett paused. "She say anything about what happened?" Elias shook his head. "Not yet. She's in shock. Give her time." But as the evening deepened and the train made camp for the night, the girl finally spoke. Her name was Sarah Colton, and the settlement had been her home. She told her story in fits and starts, her voice barely above a whisper, and what she described made Elias's blood run cold. The attackers had come at dawn. They weren't raiders or bandits. They were organized, disciplined. They demanded the settlement's weapons and supplies, and when the people refused, they'd burned everything, killed everyone who fought back. Sarah had hidden in the cellar when she heard the shooting start, and by the time she emerged, her family was gone. "Did you see their faces?" Garrett asked gently. "Anything that might help us identify them?" Sarah nodded slowly. "There was one man, the leader. He was tall, wearing a black coat. He had a scar here." She touched her left cheek. "And he kept talking about weapons. Said they needed weapons for what was coming. Said the frontier was going to burn." Vera, who had been listening from the edge of the crowd, went very still. Elias saw it. The way her whole body tensed, the way her eyes narrowed. She knew something important. Later, after the camp had settled and Sarah had been put to bed in one of the family wagons, Vera pulled Elias aside. "That settlement wasn't random," she said without preamble. "It was a test. Whoever's running this weapons operation wanted to see if their buyers could handle a military-style raid. That girl survived by pure luck, but she wasn't supposed to. This was a demonstration. A demonstration for who? For whoever's buying the rifles. Proof that they'll be used effectively." Vera's face was grim in the moonlight. "Which means we're running out of time. The exchange is going to happen soon, maybe within the next few days. I need to find those weapons before they change hands." "How?" By searching every wagon in this train if I have to. She looked at him directly. I need your help, Elias. These people trust you now. They think you're a hero. That means they won't question if you ask to check supplies, make sure everyone's properly stocked, look for any security weaknesses. You can move freely, ask questions, get access to places I can't. You want me to spy on these people? These families who've done nothing but show me kindness? I want you to help me save their lives, Vera shot back. Because if those weapons reach their destination, this whole territory is going to explode. Settlements like the one we saw today, burned to the ground. Men, women, children, all dead. And these families, this train, were right in the middle of the target zone. Elias closed his eyes. He was so tired of being afraid, tired of pretending, tired of being swept along by forces beyond his control. But Vera was right. If he could help prevent another massacre like the one they'd witnessed, didn't he have a moral obligation to try? Tell me what you need, he said quietly. Over the next 3 days, Elias conducted what he thought of as his inspection tour. He moved from wagon to wagon under the guise of checking medical supplies and making sure families were properly equipped for the harsh terrain ahead. People welcomed him readily, proud to show the train's hero their provisions, their preparations, their readiness for whatever dangers lay ahead. And Elias looked. He looked at every crate, every barrel, every trunk. He asked casual questions about where supplies had been purchased, how heavy loads were, whether anyone had taken on cargo for others. Most of it was exactly what it appeared to be: food, tools, family possessions. But one wagon bothered him. It belonged to a merchant named Horace Talmadge, a quiet man who traveled with his wife and adult son. They claimed to be transporting trade goods to Fort Collins. Nothing unusual. But their wagon sat lower on its axles than it should for the goods they claimed to carry. And when Elias had casually asked to inspect their medical supplies, Talmadge had been just a fraction too quick to agree, guiding Elias to a specific trunk while steering him away from 3 large crates stacked at the rear of the wagon bed. Elias reported his suspicions to Vera that night. Talmadge, she repeated, her eyes distant. I've been watching him too. He's careful, doesn't socialize much, keeps his family close. Classic profile for a smuggler. So what do? We watch. We wait, and when he makes his move, we follow. Vera checked her rifle, her movements automatic. The exchange will happen soon. It has to. We're only a few days from Fort Collins now, and once we reach the settlement, he'll lose his window of opportunity. He'll have to transfer the weapons before then. And if you're wrong, if it's not Talmadge, then we keep looking until we find the right person. Her jaw set. One way or another, Elias, I'm going to stop this shipment. The only question is how many people die before I do. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He lay in his bedroll staring up at the vast sweep of stars, thinking about Sarah Colton's hollow eyes, and the burned settlement, and the weight of lies that kept piling higher on his shoulders. He'd come west to build something, to prove something, to be more than the timid academic his father had always seen. Instead, he'd become a fraud, a pretender playing at heroism, while a woman who barely knew him risked everything to stop a war. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled. The sound carried across the empty miles, wild and lonely and utterly free. Elias envied that coyote more than he could say. The answer came 2 nights later, delivered not by careful investigation, but by pure accident, and Elias's growing inability to sleep through the chorus of coyotes that seemed to follow the wagon train like a Greek chorus of doom. He'd given up on rest around midnight and wandered to the edge of camp, thinking that distance from the snoring settlers might help. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to cast sharp shadows across the rocky ground. Elias found a flat stone and sat, wrapping his coat tighter against the night chill, watching the horizon where darkness met darker darkness. That's when he heard the voices. They came from beyond the western perimeter, low and urgent. Elias froze, every muscle tense. The camp guards were posted on the eastern side, watching for pursuit from the direction they'd come. No one was watching the path ahead. Slowly, carefully, Elias moved toward the sound. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was stupid, reckless, exactly the kind of thing that got men killed. But his feet kept moving, drawn by a terrible curiosity and the growing certainty that whatever was happening out there in the dark, it mattered. He crept between two massive boulders and found himself looking down into a shallow wash. 3 horses stood ground-tied in the sandy bottom. 3 men stood beside them, and even in the uncertain moonlight, Elias recognized one of them immediately. Horace Talmadge. The merchant was talking to 2 strangers, rough-looking men whose hands never strayed far from their gun belts. Money changed hands, folded papers, low words Elias couldn't quite make out. Then Talmadge turned back toward camp, and the 2 strangers mounted their horses and rode west into the night. Elias pressed himself flat against the rock, barely breathing. Talmadge passed within 10 feet of his hiding spot, close enough that Elias could hear the man's boots crunching on gravel, could smell tobacco and sweat. Then he was gone, heading back toward the circled wagons. Elias waited a full 5 minutes before he dared move. His legs were shaking when he finally stood. He'd seen it. Proof. Talmadge meeting with unknown men in the middle of the night, exchanging something that looked an awful lot like payment and instructions. He had to tell Vera. He found her awake in their wagon, cleaning her rifle by the light of a shielded candle. She looked up as he climbed in, and whatever she saw in his face made her set the weapon aside immediately. What happened? Elias told her everything, his words tumbling over each other in his haste. Vera listened without interruption, her expression growing harder with each sentence. "You're certain it was Talmadge?" she asked when he finished. "Absolutely. I saw his face clearly." "And the men he met? Did you recognize them?" "No, but they looked like the kind of men who'd burn a settlement for the right price." Elias's hands were still shaking. "What do we do now?" Vera was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the rifle stock in a rapid, nervous pattern. Then she stood, moving with sudden decision. "We search his wagon, tonight, while everyone's asleep." "Are you insane? If we're caught, we won't be caught if you keep watch properly." She was already moving, checking her weapons, her face set with grim determination. "This is what I came here to do, Elias. This is the moment. Either we act now, or those weapons disappear and people die. Your choice." It wasn't really a choice at all, and they both knew it. They moved through the sleeping camp like ghosts, keeping to the shadows between wagons, avoiding the few still-burning fires. Talmadge's wagon sat near the center of the circle, which made the approach more difficult, but also provided more cover. The merchant and his family were asleep inside, their soft snores audible through the canvas covering. Vera pointed to a spot between 2 wagons where Elias could watch both approaches to Talmadge's position. He nodded, his throat too tight for words, and pressed himself into the darkness while Vera moved to the rear of the merchant's wagon. The minutes that followed were the longest of Elias's life. He stood motionless, his eyes straining to catch any movement, his ears hyper-alert for the slightest sound of someone stirring. A dog barked somewhere on the far side of camp, and Elias nearly jumped out of his skin. A man coughed and rolled over in his bedroll. A baby whimpered and was quickly soothed. And through it all, Vera worked in absolute silence at the rear of Talmadge's wagon. She emerged after what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes. Her face was pale in the moonlight, and she carried something small clutched in her fist. She jerked her head toward the perimeter, and they retreated the way they'd come, not speaking until they were well away from the sleeping camp. "Show me," Elias whispered. Vera opened her hand. Lying on her palm was a folded piece of paper, dark with what looked like dried blood. She unfolded it carefully, and Elias saw columns of numbers, names, locations. A manifest. 50 rifles, Vera read quietly. High-quality Springfields, military issue, stolen from an army depot 6 months ago, being sold to a coalition of hostile tribes for $10,000 in gold. She looked up at Elias. "And the exchange is happening tomorrow night, 15 miles west of here, at a place called Devil's Gate." "Tomorrow?" Elias felt ice slide down his spine. "How do you know?" "Because I found this tucked into one of the weapon crates. Talmadge was sloppy, kept his receipt." She refolded the paper with shaking hands. "Those men you saw him meeting tonight, they were the buyer's scouts, confirming the location and timing. Tomorrow night, Talmadge will slip away from camp with those crates, make the exchange, and vanish with enough gold to live like a king anywhere he wants. We have to tell Garrett." "And say what? That we broke into a man's wagon in the middle of the night and stole his papers? He'll throw us off the train, or worse." Vera shook her head. "No, we handle this ourselves." How? Elias demanded. There are 3 of them, Talmadge, his wife, his son, and 2 of us. And I can't shoot, remember? You made sure everyone thinks I can, but we both know the truth. I know the truth about a lot of things. Vera's eyes were fierce in the darkness, including the fact that you're braver than you think you are. You proved that when you went into that burning settlement. When you saved that girl. When you stood beside me during that raid, even though you were terrified. Being too scared to run isn't the same as being brave. Out here it is. She gripped his shoulders, forcing him to meet her gaze. Listen to me. Tomorrow, Talmadge is going to make an excuse to separate from the train. He'll claim mechanical trouble, or that he needs to hunt, or some other lie. Garrett will believe him because why wouldn't he? Talmadge has been the perfect quiet merchant this whole journey, and you want us to follow him. I want us to stop him. Vera released Elias and stepped back. Those rifles can't reach their destination. If they do, the whole frontier explodes. Settlements burn. Families die. Everything you came west to build gets destroyed before it even starts. I came west to pull teeth, Elias said weakly. No. Vera's voice was gentle now, almost kind. You came west because you were tired of being safe, because you wanted to matter. Well, congratulations, Dr. Mercer. You matter now. The question is what you're going to do about it. Elias looked at her standing there in the moonlight. This woman he'd married 5 weeks ago, knowing nothing about her except that she was dangerous and desperate and completely, terrifyingly competent. She'd lied to him, used him, dragged him into a conspiracy that could get them both killed. And yet, when he looked at her now, what he saw wasn't deception. It was determination, purpose, the kind of certainty he'd never felt about anything in his entire careful, measured life. Tell me the plan, he said quietly. Relief flickered across Vera's face so quickly he almost missed it. We shadow Talmadge when he leaves tomorrow. Keep our distance. Don't engage until he's made the exchange and separated from the buyers. Then we take him before he can get back to the train with the gold. Just the 2 of us against 4 armed men? Just the 2 of us with surprise, superior position, and the knowledge that we're on the right side of this fight. Vera's smile was sharp as broken glass. And you've got one advantage they don't know about. What's that? Me. She touched the rifle slung across her back. I'm a very good shot, Elias. The best you've ever seen. And I don't miss when it matters. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. The wagon train made good progress across increasingly rough terrain, the wheels grinding over rocks and through shallow creek beds. Elias drove their wagon with mechanical precision, his mind racing through every possible outcome of the night ahead. Most of them ended with him dead in a ditch somewhere. His grand frontier adventure concluded before it had properly begun. Talmadge made his move just before sunset. Elias watched from across the camp as the merchant approached Garrett, his expression concerned. They talked for several minutes, Talmadge gesturing toward his wagon, then west toward the darkening horizon. Garrett frowned, but eventually nodded. The merchant returned to his family, and within minutes, his wagon was pulling away from the main circle, heading into the gathering dusk. Claimed he saw smoke earlier, Vera murmured, appearing beside Elias like a ghost. Said he wanted to investigate before full dark, make sure there weren't raiders waiting ahead. Garrett bought it completely. Are we really doing this? We're really doing this? She handed him a pistol, smaller than a rifle but no less deadly. You probably won't need to fire it, but if things go wrong, point and squeeze. The recoil will knock you back, so brace yourself. And for the love of everything, don't close your eyes when you shoot. Elias took the weapon with numb fingers. It was heavier than he expected, cold and brutal in his hand. A tool designed for exactly one purpose. They left camp 20 minutes after Talmadge, taking only their horses and the barest supplies. Vera had told one of the women that they were scouting ahead for tomorrow's route, would be back by morning. No one questioned it. Why would they? The hero dentist and his capable wife doing what needed to be done to keep everyone safe. The lies just kept piling higher. They rode west through country that grew steadily more broken and hostile. Rock formations jutted from the earth like broken teeth, casting long shadows in the fading light. Somewhere ahead, Talmadge's wagon rolled on, carrying enough weapons to start a war. Vera set a punishing pace, pushing their horses hard, but not so hard they'd be useless when they were needed most. She rode like she'd been born in a saddle, her body moving with the horse's rhythm, her eyes constantly scanning the terrain. Elias clung to his mount and tried not to fall off. Full darkness had fallen when they spotted the wagon. It sat in a narrow canyon, barely visible in the starlight. Talmadge had stopped beside a natural formation that locals called Devil's Gate, two massive rock pillars that framed the western sky like the entrance to hell itself. Vera dismounted and pulled Elias down beside her. They left the horses ground-tied and moved forward on foot, using the rocks for cover. As they got closer, Elias could see figures moving around the wagon. Talmadge and his son were unloading the crates, working with quick efficiency. The merchant's wife sat on the wagon seat, a rifle across her lap, watching the darkness. And approaching from the west, clearly visible now against the stars, came 4 riders. "The buyers," Vera breathed, "right on time." They were close enough now that Elias could hear voices, though not the words. The riders dismounted. One of them, a tall man in a black coat with something dark marking his face, stepped forward to inspect the crates. Even from a distance, Elias could see the scar on the man's left cheek, exactly where Sarah Colton had described it. This was the man who'd burned her settlement, who'd killed her family. Elias felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. Not quite anger, not quite hate, but something in between. A certainty that what they were doing here mattered, that stopping this exchange was worth whatever price it demanded. The inspection continued. Talmadge's son pried open one of the crates, revealing neat rows of rifles packed in oiled cloth. The scarred man lifted one, checked the action, nodded his approval. Money changed hands, a leather pouch that clinked heavily when Talmadge took it. "Now," Vera whispered, "before they separate." She moved like lightning, rising from cover with her rifle already shouldered. Her voice rang out across the canyon, hard and commanding. "Nobody move! Put your hands where I can see them!" For one frozen instant, everyone obeyed. The buyers, Talmadge, his family, they all stood motionless, shocked by the sudden appearance of a woman with a rifle who clearly knew how to use it. Then everything went to hell. The scarred man drew and fired in one smooth motion. The bullet whined past Vera's head, so close Elias heard it crack the air. She returned fire without hesitation, and the man went down hard, clutching his leg. "Run!" Talmadge screamed to his family. His son grabbed the gold pouch and sprinted for the horses. The merchant's wife opened fire from the wagon seat, her shots wild but numerous enough to drive Vera back into cover. The other 3 buyers scattered, seeking position in the rocks. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, the muzzle flashes bright in the darkness. Elias pressed himself flat against a boulder, his borrowed pistol clutched uselessly in both hands. This was chaos, absolute chaos, nothing like the organized fight with the raiders. "Elias!" Vera's voice, sharp with urgency. "The sun! Don't let him reach the horses!" Elias looked up and saw Talmadge's son running across open ground, the gold pouch bouncing against his hip, heading for where the buyer's horses stood ground-tied. If he reached them, if he escaped with that gold, this whole nightmare would be for nothing. Elias's body moved before his mind could catch up. He pushed off the boulder and ran, cutting at an angle to intercept the younger man. His boots slipped on loose rock. His breath came in ragged gasps. Behind him, Vera's rifle cracked again and again, keeping the buyers pinned down. The son saw him coming. The young man's hand went for his gun. Elias didn't think, didn't aim, didn't remember any of Vera's instructions about bracing and not closing his eyes. He just pointed the pistol and pulled the trigger. The recoil nearly broke his wrist. The noise was deafening, and the bullet went wide by at least 3 feet, disappearing harmlessly into the night. But the son flinched, stumbled, and in that moment of hesitation, Elias closed the distance and tackled him. They went down hard in a tangle of limbs. The gold pouch flew from the son's grip, scattering coins across the rocks. The younger man was stronger, more experienced at fighting, and he drove his elbow into Elias's ribs with enough force to crack bone. Elias gasped, pain exploding through his chest, but he held on. His fingers found the son's collar and he pulled, trying to use leverage and desperation to compensate for his lack of skill. The son's fist caught Elias across the jaw. Stars burst in his vision. Another blow landed on his temple, and the world tilted sideways. Elias felt his grip loosening, felt the fight slipping away from him. Then a rifle butt came down on the back of the son's skull with a solid crack. The young man went limp. Elias shoved him aside and looked up to find Vera standing over them both, her face splattered with blood that wasn't hers, her eyes wild. "Can you move?" she demanded. Elias nodded, though he wasn't sure it was true. Everything hurt. His ribs screamed with every breath. His jaw felt like it was made of broken glass. "Good. Because we're not done yet." Vera hauled him to his feet with one hand, her rifle never wavering from the rocks where the buyers had taken cover. "Talmadge is pinned down behind his wagon. His wife is out of ammunition. I heard the click 3 shots ago. The buyers are hurt but not finished. We need to end this now before reinforcements arrive." "How?" Elias managed through his damaged jaw. Vera's smile was terrible. "We give them a choice, surrender or die." She stepped into the open, fully visible, and raised her voice to carry across the canyon. "Talmadge, your son is down, your wife is defenseless, and you're surrounded. Throw out your weapons and step into the light, or I put a bullet through that wagon and we see what happens when 50 pounds of gunpowder meet a spark." Silence. Then, slowly, a rifle came flying out from behind the wagon, clattering against the rocks. Talmadge emerged with his hands raised, his face pale with defeat. "The rest of you," Vera called to the buyers. "Your leader is bleeding out. You want to join him, or do you want to ride away and pretend this never happened?" Another long pause. Then, one by one, the 3 remaining buyers appeared, their hands empty, their expressions murderous but resigned. The scarred man was being supported between 2 of them, his leg leaving a dark trail across the pale rock. "Take your boss and go," Vera said flatly. "Leave the rifles, leave the gold, and consider yourselves lucky I'm in a merciful mood. If I ever see any of you again, I won't miss next time." They went, scrambling onto their horses, dragging their wounded leader with them, disappearing into the western darkness like the devils they were. Their retreat left only silence and the smell of gun smoke drifting on the night wind. Elias stood swaying, his whole body shaking with spent adrenaline. They'd done it. Against all odds, against common sense, against every reasonable expectation, they'd actually done it. Vera was already moving, securing Talmadge and his family with rope from the wagon, checking the rifle crates to make sure they were all accounted for. She worked with quick efficiency, her movements those of someone who'd done this before, many times before. "Who are you really?" Elias asked quietly. Vera glanced at him, and for just a moment her mask slipped. He saw exhaustion there, and pain, and something that might have been relief. "Someone who's been doing this too long," she said. "Someone who's tired of watching good people die because bad people profit from chaos." She secured the last knot and stood, wiping blood from her face with her sleeve. "Someone who's grateful she didn't have to do this alone." "I didn't do anything. I missed that shot by a mile." "You distracted him long enough for me to get there. That's something." Vera moved to where Elias stood and studied his face with clinical detachment. "Your jaw is going to swell. Those ribs might be cracked. You're going to hurt like hell for a week." "Worth it," Elias said, and was surprised to find he meant it. "Yes." Vera's expression softened slightly. It was. They brought Talmadge and his family back to the wagon train just before dawn, along with the rifle crates and the recovered gold. Garrett listened to Vera's explanation with a face like carved stone. How they'd grown suspicious of the merchant, how they'd followed him, how they'd stopped the weapons exchange before it could be completed. She left out the part about breaking into Talmadge's wagon, left out the manifest she'd stolen, edited the truth just enough to make their actions seem noble rather than desperate. When she finished, Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to Talmadge, who stood bound and sullen between 2 armed men. "You got anything to say for yourself?" The merchant spat on the ground. "I was making a business transaction. Nothing more." "Business?" Garrett's voice was soft, dangerous. "You were selling weapons to hostiles who would have used them to murder families, to burn settlements, to start a war." He stepped closer to Talmadge, his face inches from the merchant's. "How much were they paying you?" "Enough to retire somewhere civilized, somewhere far from this worthless frontier and the fools who think they can tame it." Garrett hit him. One clean punch that split Talmadge's lip and sent him reeling backward into his captor's arms. "You'll be tried in Fort Collins," Garrett said coldly. and if there's any justice left in this territory, you'll hang." He turned to Elias and Vera, and his expression shifted to something approaching respect. "You two did this train, hell, this whole territory. A service tonight. Those rifles in the wrong hands would have meant death for hundreds of people, maybe thousands." He extended his hand. "I misjudged you both. I apologize." Vera shook his hand without hesitation. Elias followed suit, wincing as the movement pulled at his damaged ribs. "The doc needs medical attention," Garrett observed. "That jaw looks bad." "I'll manage," Elias said. "Like hell you will." Garrett gestured to one of the women. "Mrs. Peters, take Dr. Mercer and fix him up. That's an order." As Elias was led away, he looked back at Vera. She stood alone, watching him go, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked uncertain, vulnerable, as if the armor she wore had developed cracks she couldn't quite hide anymore. Then someone else approached her with questions about the rifles, and the mask snapped back into place. She turned away, all business again, and Elias lost sight of her in the gathering crowd. The next 3 days passed in a haze of pain and exhausted sleep. Elias's ribs were indeed cracked, his jaw swollen to twice its normal size, and every movement reminded him that heroism hurt a great deal more than he'd ever imagined. The other settlers treated him with a reverence that made him deeply uncomfortable, bringing him food and water, checking on his injuries, telling him again and again how brave he'd been. The irony wasn't lost on him. They still thought he was a crack shot, a fearless frontiersman who'd tracked down the criminals and brought them to justice. The truth, that he'd stumbled into danger, missed his only shot, and survived purely through luck and Vera's competence, remained carefully unspoken. Vera visited him once, bringing fresh bandages and a bottle of whiskey for the pain. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I got kicked by a horse." "How are you?" "Tired." She sat down on a crate across from where he lay in the wagon bed. "Garrett wants me to testify at Talmadge's trial. Tell the court everything I know about the weapons smuggling operation." "Will you?" "I'll tell them what they need to hear." Vera was quiet for a moment. "After that, I'll be moving on. There are other operations, other threats. The work doesn't stop just because we won this time." Elias felt something twist in his chest, and he was startled to realize it was disappointment. "What about our arrangement, the marriage?" "We fulfilled the terms. I got you to Fort Collins safely. You're free to set up your practice, start your new life, forget any of this ever happened." She wouldn't meet his eyes. "You'll be better off without me, Elias. I'm not the settling down type." You're leaving." "I'm leaving? When?" "Soon as we reach Fort Collins, maybe before." She finally looked at him directly. "This was always temporary. You knew that. I knew a lot of things when we started this journey. Most of them turned out to be wrong." Elias struggled to sit up, ignoring the flare of pain in his ribs. "You don't have to go, Vera. You could stay. We could make this real." "Real?" She repeated the word like it was foreign. "You don't want real with me." "Real with me is waking up one morning and finding out I've left to chase another weapons smuggler. It's never knowing if I'll come back. It's living with secrets and lies and the constant threat of violence. I think I've proven I can handle violence. You proved you can survive it once. That's not the same as choosing to live with it forever." Vera stood abruptly. "You're a good man, Elias Mercer. You deserve a good life. That's not something I can give you." She left before he could respond, disappearing into the camp, leaving him alone with his aching ribs and the growing certainty that he'd just lost something important before he'd fully understood what he had. Fort Collins appeared on the horizon 2 days later, a sprawling settlement that made Holloway Station look like a child's toy. Real buildings, real streets, real civilization spreading out across the valley floor. The wagon train rolled in to cheers and celebration, another successful crossing completed, another group of pioneers delivered safely to their new home. Talmadge and his family were immediately taken into custody by the territorial marshal, the rifle crates confiscated as evidence. Garrett gave his statement about what had happened, praising Elias and Vera for their courage and quick thinking. The marshal shook Elias's hand and called him a credit to the territory. And through it all, Vera remained distant, present but not really there, already halfway gone in every way that mattered. The night before the trial, Elias found her sitting alone outside the boarding house where they'd taken a room. She was cleaning her rifle again, that same mechanical motion he'd seen 100 times. "I'm not going to beg you to stay," he said quietly. "But I need you to know something. These past weeks, they've been the most terrifying, exhausting, painful experience of my life, and I wouldn't trade them for anything." Vera's hand stilled on the rifle. "Elias, you asked me once why I came west. The truth is, I was running away. From my father's disappointment, from my own fears, from a life that felt too small to matter. I thought I'd find purpose out here. Turns out purpose found me instead, in the form of a woman who needed a fake husband and dragged me into a conspiracy that nearly got us both killed. That's not a compliment. It's the truth." Elias sat down beside her. "You made me braver than I knew I could be. Not because you lied about what I could do, but because you believed I'd find a way to do it anyway. And I did. I saved a girl from a burned settlement. I helped stop a war. I mattered. You would have mattered anyway, with or without me. Maybe, but I wouldn't have believed it." He looked at her profile, memorizing the hard line of her jaw, the way her hair caught the lamplight. "So thank you, for the lie that became the truth, for making me into someone I didn't know I could be." Vera was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't respond. Then, slowly, she set the rifle aside and turned to face him. "What if I stayed?" she asked quietly. "What if I tried to build something here, something normal? What if I failed? What if I woke up one morning and couldn't stand the quiet, couldn't stand being safe, and ran back to the only life I know? Could you forgive that? Could you forgive me if I'm never as brave as everyone thinks I am? If the next time danger comes, I freeze or run, or get us both killed because I still don't know how to handle a gun?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "We're quite a pair, aren't we? The legendary marksman who can't shoot, and the wandering operative who doesn't know how to stay still. Sounds like the beginning of an interesting story. Or a very short one. Only one way to find out." Elias extended his hand, palm up, an offering, a question. Vera looked at it for a long moment. Then slowly, she placed her hand in his. "I can't promise I'll be good at this," she said. "I can't promise I won't embarrass us both at the trial tomorrow when I have to admit I missed that shot. You're really going to tell the truth?" "Someone once told me that out here, survival means doing things that would be unthinkable back in Boston. Well, honesty is pretty unthinkable given the lies I've been living. Time to try something different." Vera's laugh was soft and surprised. "You're either very brave or very stupid, Dr. Mercer. Can I be both?" "I suppose you can." She squeezed his hand. "All right, I'll stay. For now. We'll see where this goes. For now is enough." They sat together in the lamplight, hands joined, watching Fort Collins settle into sleep around them. Somewhere in the distance, a piano played in a saloon. Closer, a baby cried and was soothed. The ordinary sounds of civilization, of people building lives in the wilderness, of hope, persisting despite all evidence that the frontier was no place for dreams. But Elias had learned something these past weeks. Dreams were tougher than they looked. They survived lies and danger and the kind of fear that should have destroyed them. They adapted, changed shape, became something stronger than they'd started. His dream of bringing civilization to the frontier had transformed into something more complex, more real. Not a tidy dental practice serving grateful patients, but a life built with a woman who understood that civilization wasn't about safety or order. It was about standing your ground when everything told you to run, about finding the courage to try, even when you were terrified of failing, about choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. Vera's thumb traced circles on the back of his hand, a small gesture that felt enormous in its tenderness. For the first time since Holloway Station, since that desperate wedding ceremony and the gun pressed against his spine, Elias felt something that might have been peace. Or if not peace, then at least the possibility of it. And out here, possibility was more than most people got. The morning of the trial arrived with unseasonable cold, a sharp wind blowing down from the mountains that made people pull their coats tight and walk with their heads bent. Elias stood outside the territorial courthouse, a two-story building that was by far the finest structure in Fort Collins, and watched his breath cloud in the air. His ribs still ached with every deep inhale, and his jaw had turned a spectacular shade of purple-yellow that made him look like he'd lost a bar fight. Which, in a sense, he had. Vera emerged from the boarding house wearing a dress Elias had never seen before, dark green with modest lace at the collar. She looked uncomfortable in it, kept tugging at the sleeves like they constricted her movements. "You clean up well," Elias observed. "I feel like I'm wearing a costume." She grimaced. But the marshal suggested that showing up in trail clothes and gun leather might prejudice the jury. Apparently women are supposed to look delicate when they testify about stopping weapons smugglers. Heaven forbid you look competent. "Exactly, Basasims, exactly." She joined him on the courthouse steps, and they stood together watching Fort Collins wake up around them. The town was perhaps 10 times the size of Holloway Station, with actual commerce and industry visible in every direction. A blacksmith's hammer rang against an anvil. Wagons rolled past carrying lumber and supplies. Women walked to market with baskets over their arms. The ordinary machinery of civilization, functioning exactly as it was supposed to. "Second thoughts?" Vera asked quietly. Elias knew she wasn't talking about the trial. "No. You?" "About 100. She smiled, but there was tension around her eyes. "But I'm still here. That's all we can do. Keep showing up." The courthouse doors opened, and the territorial marshal appeared, a grizzled man named Hackett who'd taken their statements the previous day with shrewd attention to detail. He'd listened to Vera's account of the weapons operation without interruption, asked pointed questions about how she'd known to investigate Talmadge, and fixed Elias with a penetrating stare when he described the confrontation at Devil's Gate. "Ready?" Hackett asked now. "Judge Thornton doesn't like to be kept waiting." They followed him inside through a narrow hallway that smelled of wood polish and old paper into a courtroom packed with spectators. Apparently, the trial of a weapons smuggler was the best entertainment Fort Collins had seen in months. Every bench was filled, and people stood along the walls, craning their necks for a better view. Horace Talmadge sat at the defendant's table with a lawyer who looked barely old enough to shave. The merchant's face was carefully blank, but his hands gripped the edge of the table hard enough to whiten his knuckles. His wife and son sat in the gallery behind him, both wearing the hollow-eyed expression of people who'd watched their world collapse and still couldn't quite process it. Judge Thornton was a woman, which surprised Elias. She was perhaps 60, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She surveyed the packed courtroom with obvious displeasure. "This is a trial, not a circus," she announced, her voice cutting through the murmuring crowd like a blade. "The next person who speaks out of turn will be removed. Is that clear?" Silence fell immediately. "Good. Mr. Hackett, call your first witness." The marshal stood. "The territory calls Mrs. Vera Mercer." Vera walked to the witness stand with her spine straight and her chin up, every inch of her radiating quiet confidence despite the uncomfortable dress. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and settled into the chair with her hands folded in her lap. The questioning began gently. Hackett established the basic facts. The wagon train, the journey west, the suspicions that had first drawn Vera's attention to Talmadge. Then he moved to more dangerous territory. "Mrs. Mercer, you testified yesterday that you had reason to suspect Mr. Talmadge was involved in illegal weapons smuggling. What was the basis for that suspicion?" Vera didn't hesitate. His wagon sat too low for the cargo he claimed to be carrying. The weight distribution was wrong, and he was too careful about keeping people away from certain crates. "So you decided to investigate?" "I did." "By breaking into his wagon in the middle of the night?" A rustle went through the courtroom. Judge Thornton's gavel cracked once, sharp as a gunshot, and silence returned. Vera met Hackett's eyes steadily. "Yes, I broke into his wagon. I found the manifest documenting 50 stolen military rifles and the details of their planned sale to hostile parties. That's when I knew we had to act." "You could have brought this information to the wagon master, Samuel Garrett. Why didn't you?" "Because I had no proof that would hold up in any kind of official inquiry. A piece of paper I'd stolen? My word against a respected merchant's? Mr. Garrett would have been obligated to throw me off the train at best, or have me arrested at worst." Vera's voice was calm, matter of fact. "So my husband and I made the decision to follow Mr. Talmadge and catch him in the act. A dangerous decision. The only decision that would save lives." Hackett nodded, seemingly satisfied. Tell the court what happened at Devil's Gate. Vera recounted the events of that night with clinical precision. The meeting between Talmadge and the buyers, the exchange of rifles for gold, the moment when she and Elias had revealed themselves and demanded surrender. She described the firefight that followed, the injuries sustained, the eventual capture of Talmadge and his family. And the rifles? Hackett asked. You recovered all 50? Every single one. They're currently in your evidence storage, exactly where we delivered them. Thank you, Mrs. Mercer. Hackett sat down, and Talmadge's young lawyer stood up, looking nervous but determined. Mrs. Mercer, he began, his voice cracking slightly. You claim you suspected my client based solely on the weight of his wagon and his protective attitude toward his cargo. Isn't it true that many merchants are protective of valuable trade goods? Yes. So your suspicion could have been entirely wrong. It could have been, but it wasn't. The lawyer flushed. You admit to breaking into a private citizen's wagon without warrant or cause. I had cause. A settlement had been burned to the ground by men using the same tactics as the buyers at Devil's Gate. A young girl had been orphaned. People were dead, Mr. Gaines, and more would die if those weapons reached their destination. That was my cause. But you had no legal authority to conduct a search. No, Vera agreed. I had moral authority. Sometimes that has to be enough. Judge Thornton leaned forward. Mrs. Mercer, are you employed by any territorial or federal law enforcement agency? No, Your Honor. Are you a licensed investigator or bounty hunter? No, Your Honor. Then what exactly are you? Vera was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the courtroom. I'm someone who lost everything to men like Horace Talmadge. My first husband was killed in a raid carried out with illegally sold weapons. My home was burned. My family was destroyed. I swore that day that I would spend the rest of my life making sure other families didn't suffer the same fate. So I learned to track smugglers, to recognize their patterns, to stop them before they could profit from death. I'm not a lawman, Your Honor. I'm just someone who gives a damn. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Judge Thornton seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Finally, she nodded slowly. Continue, Mr. Gaines. But the young lawyer had lost his momentum. He asked a few more questions, received calm, unshakable answers, and eventually sat down looking defeated. The territory calls Dr. Elias Mercer. Elias's legs felt unsteady as he walked to the witness stand. Every eye in the courtroom was on him, the legendary dentist who could shoot like a marksman and fight like a soldier, the hero of the wagon train, the man who'd saved them all. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, knowing that in the next few minutes he was going to destroy every bit of that carefully constructed legend. Hackett stood. Dr. Mercer, please tell the court about your role in the events at Devil's Gate. Elias took a deep breath, felt his cracked ribs protest, and began to speak. I need to correct something first, a misunderstanding that's been allowed to persist. During the raid on our wagon train early in the journey, everyone assumed I fired the shot that wounded the raider leader. I didn't. My wife did. I've never fired a rifle in my life. I barely know how to hold one. The courtroom erupted. Voices rose in shock and confusion. Judge Thornton's gavel cracked 3 times before order was restored. Continue, she said curtly. I'm a dentist. That's all I've ever been. I came west with some romantic notion of bringing civilization to the frontier, and instead I found myself in a world I didn't understand and couldn't navigate. I married Vera, Mrs. Mercer, as a matter of convenience. She needed a husband's name to join the wagon train. I needed a way out of Holloway Station. It was supposed to be temporary, a business arrangement. He looked at Vera, saw her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. But then I learned what she was really doing, about the weapons, the conspiracy, the danger. And I had a choice. I could walk away, pretend I didn't know, let someone else handle it, or I could help, even though I was terrified and completely unqualified. Elias turned back to face the courtroom. At Devil's Gate, I tried to stop Talmadge's son from escaping with the gold. I fired 1 shot. I missed by at least 3 feet. Then I tackled him, got beaten half to death, and only survived because my wife knocked him unconscious before he could finish the job. So you're saying you contributed nothing to the capture? Gaines asked, seizing on what he apparently thought was an opening. I'm saying I contributed what I could, which was determination, luck, and a willingness to get hurt to do what was right. Elias met the lawyer's eyes. "I'm not a hero, Mr. Gaines. I'm just a man who was in the right place at the right time with a woman brave enough to actually do what needed doing. But I'll tell you this. Those rifles are off the street. Talmadge is in custody. And whatever small part I played in that, I'd do it again without hesitation." Gaines opened his mouth, seemed to think better of whatever he'd been about to say, and sat down. Hackett asked a few more questions, establishing the timeline and confirming the evidence. Then Elias was dismissed, and he walked back to his seat on legs that trembled with relief and exhaustion. He'd done it, told the truth, destroyed the legend. And somehow, looking at the faces in the courtroom, he didn't see contempt or mockery. He saw something that looked almost like respect. The trial continued for another 2 hours. Hackett called Samuel Garrett, who testified about Talmadge's behavior on the trail and the recovery of the rifles. He called the Territorial Armory Commander, who confirmed that 50 Springfield rifles had been stolen 6 months prior and that the weapons and evidence matched the theft exactly. He called the doctor who'd treated the wounded buyers, who described injuries consistent with a firefight. Talmadge's lawyer tried to mount a defense, arguing that his client had been coerced, that he'd been threatened by dangerous men and had no choice but to cooperate. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the manifest Vera had recovered, now entered into evidence, contained Talmadge's own handwriting documenting the sale price and his percentage of the profit. When both sides had finished, Judge Thornton dismissed the jury to deliberate. They were gone less than 30 minutes. "We find the defendant, Horace Talmadge, guilty on all charges." Talmadge's wife let out a small, broken sound. The merchant himself showed no reaction, just stared straight ahead as if he'd already left his body behind. Judge Thornton's voice was cold as mountain ice. "Mr. Talmadge, you have been found guilty of weapons smuggling, conspiracy to commit murder, and treason against the territorial government. Under the laws of this territory, I could sentence you to hang. However, given your cooperation in identifying your co-conspirators and the fact that no weapons ultimately reached their intended destination, I'm prepared to show a degree of mercy." She paused, letting the word hang in the air. "You will serve 20 years hard labor at the territorial prison. Your assets will be seized and sold, with proceeds going to the families affected by the raid on the Colton settlement. Your wife and son, who appear to have been acting under your direction, will be released with time served and barred from territorial commerce for a period of 10 years. Thornton's eyes were flint hard. "You came to the frontier thinking you could profit from death and chaos. Instead, you'll spend the next 2 decades breaking rocks and remembering what your greed cost you. May you use that time wisely." She brought her gavel down. "This court is adjourned." The crowd began to disperse, voices rising in animated conversation. Elias sat motionless, processing the fact that it was over. Talmadge would spend the rest of his productive life in prison. The rifles were secured. The conspiracy was broken. They'd won. Vera appeared beside him, her hand finding his. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Tell them the truth. You could have kept the legend intact." "The legend was a lie. I'm tired of lies." Elias stood, his ribs protesting. "Besides, you're the one who deserves the credit. Might as well let people know it. They won't remember me. Stories like this, they always reshape themselves to fit expectations. Give it a year, and you'll be the hero again. People prefer their heroes to be men. Then I'll keep correcting them until they get it right." They walked out of the courthouse together into pale sunlight that was just starting to warm the cold morning air. A small crowd had gathered on the steps. People from the wagon train, local citizens who'd attended the trial, reporters from the territorial newspaper. They surged forward, questions flying, but Hackett intervened. "Dr. Mercer, Mrs. Mercer, if you'd come with me, there's someone who wants to meet you." He led them around the side of the courthouse to a small office where a man waited. He was perhaps 50, dressed in the kind of expensive suit that spoke of real authority, with a marshal's badge pinned to his vest that looked different from Hackett's, more ornate, more official. "Dr. Mercer, Mrs. Mercer, this is Marshal William Cross," Hackett said. "Federal Marshal, Northern Territories Division." Cross extended his hand. "I've been following your case with great interest. The work you did stopping that weapons shipment, that's exactly the kind of proactive intelligence gathering we need out here. The frontier's changing, getting more complex. We need people who can think on their feet, who aren't bound by conventional law enforcement limitations. Vera's eyes narrowed. What are you offering, Marshal? A job. Both of you. Cross gestured to chairs, and they sat. Mrs. Mercer, your skills are obvious. You tracked a smuggling operation, infiltrated it, and stopped it with minimal casualties. That's professional work. We could use someone with your talents on a more official basis. And me? Elias asked, genuinely confused. I just admitted in court that I'm not a fighter. No, but you're a doctor with the courage to go where you're needed, even when it's dangerous. The frontier is desperate for medical professionals willing to work in contested territories. And having a husband-wife team, one with investigative skills, one with medical expertise, that's a powerful combination. Cross leaned forward. I'm authorized to offer you both positions as territorial agents. Good pay, federal backing, and the authority to pursue cases across multiple jurisdictions. You'd be based here in Fort Collins, but travel is needed. Vera and Elias exchanged glances. The offer was generous, almost suspiciously so, and yet there was something appealing about it, a way to formalize what they'd already proven they could do together. We'll need to discuss it, Vera said carefully. Of course. Take your time. Cross stood. But I hope you'll seriously consider it. The frontier needs people like you. People who understand that sometimes the law has to bend a little to protect the innocent. After he'd left, Elias and Vera sat in silence for a long moment. What do you think? Elias asked finally. I think it's a trap, Vera said bluntly. Men like Cross, they make offers like this when they want to control you. Bring you into the system where they can monitor you, direct you, make sure your talents only get used in ways they approve of. But it would also give us resources we don't have, legal authority, access to intelligence networks, a salary that would let us actually build a life instead of constantly scrambling. She rubbed her temples. I don't know, Elias. Part of me wants to tell him to go to hell and keep working independently, but another part thinks maybe this is how we do the most good. We don't have to decide today. No, we should take our time, talk to people we trust, figure out what we actually want our lives to look like. Vera stood, tugged at the constricting dress again. Right now, I just want to get out of this costume and into clothes I can actually move in. They walked back to the boarding house through streets that were steadily filling with midday traffic. Fort Collins was alive in a way Holloway Station had never been, with energy and optimism and the unmistakable sense of a community that believed in its own future. This is what I imagined, Elias said quietly. When I decided to come west, a real town with real people building real lives, I thought I'd hang out my shingle, treat patients, become part of a community. You still can. Marshal Cross's offer doesn't have to be all or nothing. You could maintain a practice here, take cases when they come up. Vera glanced at him. What do you want, Elias? If you could build your life exactly the way you wanted, what would it look like? It was a question no one had ever asked him before. Not his father, not his colleagues, not even himself in any serious way. He'd always just assumed his life would follow a predetermined path. Education, practice, respectability, gradual irrelevance. Coming west had been his one act of rebellion, and even that had been driven more by desperation than genuine desire. But now, standing in the middle of Fort Collins with a wife he'd married under false pretenses who'd somehow become real, with a reputation for heroism he didn't deserve but had tried his best to earn, with the memory of fear and courage mixing together into something that felt like purpose, now the question seemed to demand a real answer. I want to matter, he said finally. I want to wake up knowing that what I do makes a difference, even if it's small. I want to build something that lasts. And I want... He stopped, surprised by what he was about to say. I want to do it with you. Not because we're trapped in some arrangement, but because we choose to. Vera's expression softened in a way he'd rarely seen. That's a better answer than I expected. What about you? What do you want? She was quiet for a long time, watching the people moving past them on the street. I want to stop running. I've been running since my first husband died, chasing smugglers and weapons dealers and anyone else I could blame for what happened. I told myself it was about justice, about preventing other tragedies, and maybe some of it was, but mostly I was just too angry and too broken to imagine doing anything else. And now? Now I'm still angry, still broken probably, but I'm also tired, and I'm starting to think that maybe preventing tragedy and building something good aren't mutually exclusive. She looked at him directly. I think I want to try staying, really staying, not just pausing between missions, see what that feels like. Even though it terrifies you, especially because it terrifies me. A ghost of a smile. Someone once told me that out here, survival means doing things that would be unthinkable back east. Well, domestic happiness is pretty unthinkable for someone like me. Time to try something different. Elias laughed, surprised by the joy that bubbled up despite everything. The pain, the exhaustion, the weight of truths finally told. We're quite a pair. We really are. Vera took his hand, her grip strong and certain. So what do we do? Take Cross's offer, tell him to go to hell, open a dental practice and pretend none of this ever happened? I think we take some time. Figure out what combination of options lets us both have what we want. Maybe I establish a practice here, and we take federal cases when they align with our values. Maybe we tell Cross we'll work as independent contractors rather than full agents. Maybe we just see what happens and adapt as we go, Vera finished. Stop trying to plan everything 3 moves ahead. That's very unlike you. I know, terrifying, isn't it? They reached the boarding house and climbed the stairs to their room. It was small but clean, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the main street. Vera immediately began stripping off the uncomfortable dress, replacing it with the trail clothes she'd worn for weeks. Elias watched her transform back into the woman he'd met in Holloway Station. Practical, capable, ready for anything. Better? He asked. Infinitely. She sat on the edge of the bed and started pulling on her boots. You know what the strangest part of all this is? I can think of several candidates. I'm actually looking forward to tomorrow. Not because there's a mission or a case or someone to catch, just because it's tomorrow. And we'll both be here to see it. Vera finished with her boots and looked up at him. When's the last time you felt that way? Elias thought about it. Honestly, never. I was always so focused on what I should be doing, what was expected of me, what came next in the plan. I don't think I ever just looked forward to a day for its own sake. Well, Vera stood and moved to the window, looking out at Fort Collins bathed in afternoon light. Tomorrow we could walk around town, see what kind of properties might work for a dental practice, talk to locals about what the community needs, have dinner somewhere that isn't jerky and hardtack, maybe even relax for 5 consecutive minutes without expecting someone to shoot at us. That sounds perfect. It sounds boring. It sounds perfect, Elias repeated firmly. He moved to stand beside her at the window. We've earned boring, Vera. We stopped a war, caught a smuggler, survived a journey that should have killed us both multiple times. I think we're entitled to a day or two of absolutely nothing exciting happening. You're probably right. She leaned against him slightly, a gesture of trust and weariness. I'm just not sure I know how to do boring anymore. Then we'll learn together. Add it to the list of things we're figuring out as we go. They stood together watching the street below, where ordinary life continued its ordinary rhythms. A wagon rolled past loaded with lumber. 2 women stopped to chat on the corner. A dog chased a cat between buildings. The mundane machinery of civilization, beautiful in its predictability. Somewhere in the building below, someone was playing a piano. The music drifted up through the floorboards. A melody Elias didn't recognize, but that felt like it belonged to this moment. Neither triumphant nor tragic, just present. Elias, Vera's voice was quiet. Yes? Thank you. For telling the truth today. For not letting me disappear into your legend. You were never part of my legend. You were always better than that. We both were, I think. Better than the stories people told about us. Messier, more afraid, more human. She turned to face him fully. I like this better, the truth, even when it's complicated. Especially when it's complicated, Elias agreed. Complicated means real. Night was falling over Fort Collins, bringing with it the promise of cold and the comfort of lamplight glowing in windows. Tomorrow would bring decisions about Marshall Cross's offer, about where to live, about what shape their lives would take. But tonight, they had this room, this moment, this hard-won peace. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything they'd fought for without knowing they were fighting for it. And for the first time since leaving Boston, Elias felt like he'd finally arrived at the place he was supposed to be. The boring day Elias had promised turned out to be a lie, though not through any fault of their own. They woke to pounding on their door at dawn, and when Elias stumbled to answer it, still half asleep and fumbling for his glasses, he found Marshal Hackett standing in the hallway with an expression that promised trouble. "Get dressed," Hackett said without preamble. "Both of you. There's been a development." 10 minutes later, they were following him through empty streets toward the edge of town. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky with streaks of pale gold, and Elias's breath fogged in the cold air. Vera walked beside him, fully alert despite the early hour, her hand resting on the pistol at her hip. "What kind of development?" she asked. "The kind that makes me wish I'd retired last year." Hackett led them to a small building that served as the territorial marshal's office and jail. "We got a visitor last night. Came in quiet, asked for you two by name. He's waiting inside." The man sitting in Hackett's office was tall and weathered, with the kind of face that had seen too much sun and not enough kindness. He wore trail clothes that had seen hard use, and his boots were caked with mud that was still drying. When they entered, he stood immediately. "Dr. Mercer. Mrs. Mercer. Thank you for coming." His voice was rough, like gravel sliding down a tin roof. "My name is Thomas Brennan. I rode 4 days straight to find you." "Why?" Vera asked bluntly. Brennan pulled a folded paper from his coat and laid it on Hackett's desk. It was another manifest, similar to the one Vera had recovered from Talmadge's wagon. But the numbers were different, bigger. 100 rifles, Brennan said quietly, being moved through a settlement called Prescott Ridge, about 80 miles northwest of here. Same operation as Talmadge was running, same buyers. Except this time, they're not being careful. They're moving fast, which means the exchange is happening soon. Maybe within the week. Elias felt his stomach drop. "How do you know about this?" "Because I was part of it." Brennan met his eyes directly. "I was supposed to help move the weapons, but when I heard what happened here, how you stopped Talmadge, recovered those rifles, I started thinking about what I was really doing, about what those guns would be used for." He paused. "I had a sister. She lived in a settlement that got raided 5 years back. She didn't make it. I told myself I was just trying to survive out here, that what people did with merchandise I transported wasn't my concern. But that was a lie, and I'm tired of living with it." Vera studied him with those sharp eyes that saw through pretense. "You're risking your life by coming here. The people running this operation, they'll kill you if they find out you talked." "I know, but I can't." Brennan's voice cracked slightly. "I can't keep pretending anymore, not after what happened to Sarah. She was just a kid." "Sarah Colton?" Elias asked. "You knew her?" "Knew her whole family. They were good people. Didn't deserve what happened to them." Brennan straightened his shoulders. "I'm here because I want to help you stop this. I know the route they're taking, the timeline, the people involved, and I'm willing to testify against all of them if it means those rifles never reached their destination." Hackett leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "This is exactly the kind of intelligence Marshal Cross was talking about. If we can break this operation wide open, shut down the whole smuggling network, that changes everything for the territory." "It's also extremely dangerous," Vera said. 100 rifles means more guards, better security, people willing to kill to protect their investment. This isn't like Talmadge, where we caught them by surprise. They'll be expecting trouble. Which is why we need to move fast and smart." Hackett stood. "I'm sending word to Marshal Cross immediately. This is his jurisdiction. But in the meantime, I want you two to sit down with Brennan and get every detail you can. Routes, names, schedules, everything." They spent the next 3 hours in that cramped office, going over Brennan's information with painstaking thoroughness. Vera asked questions with the precision of someone who'd done this kind of interrogation before, while Elias took notes in his careful, academic handwriting. The picture that emerged was troubling. The operation was bigger than they'd imagined. Talmadge had been just one piece of a network that stretched across multiple territories, moving weapons from army depots and settlements to buyers who paid in gold and asked no questions. The man running it was someone called Clayton, and when Brennan described him, Elias felt ice slide down his spine. "Clayton Fisk?" he asked. "The trader from Holloway Station?" Brennan nodded. "You know him?" He's the one who cheated me when I first arrived, sold me a broken wagon and a dying horse. Elias looked at Vera. He knew we were leaving with the wagon train. He could have been watching us the whole time. He was watching, Brennan confirmed. He watches everyone. That's how he operates. Finds people who are desperate or greedy or both, recruits them into his network, uses them until they're no longer useful. Talmadge was one of his. I'm another. There are dozens more. And now he's moving 100 rifles through Prescott Ridge, Vera said. Why there? What's special about that location? It's remote, defensible, and right on the edge of hostile territory. The buyers can move in, make the exchange, and disappear before anyone knows what happened. By the time word reaches Fort Collins, they'll be 200 miles away with enough firepower to hold off any pursuit. Brennan's jaw tightened. Fisk has been planning this for months. It's his big score, the one that lets him retire with enough money to live like a king anywhere he wants. Then we stop him, Elias heard himself say. Both Vera and Hackett turned to look at him in surprise. What? You think I'm going to let the man who swindled me destroy the frontier? Not a chance. Vera's smile was fierce and proud. I knew there was a reason I married you. Marshal Cross arrived 2 days later with a force of 10 federal marshals and a plan that involved overwhelming force and strategic positioning. He laid it out in Hackett's office with maps and diagrams, his voice confident and certain. We'll surround Prescott Ridge before the exchange happens, cut off all escape routes. When Fisk and his people arrive with the weapons, we take them all into custody simultaneously. Quick, clean, minimal casualties. And if they fight, Vera asked, then we're prepared to respond with appropriate force. Cross's expression was hard. These are weapons smugglers and traitors. They've made their choices. Elias shifted uncomfortably. The plan made sense tactically, but something about it bothered him. What about the people living in Prescott Ridge, the families who have nothing to do with this? We'll evacuate them before we move in. Tell them there's been a threat. Get them to safety. Once the operation is concluded, they can return. Cross looked at Elias. I understand your concern, Doctor, but we can't let sentiment compromise the mission. Too much is at stake. Over the next week, preparations moved forward with military efficiency. Cross's marshals gathered intelligence, mapped approach routes, coordinated timing. Brennan worked with them, providing details about Fisk's operation that proved invaluable. And Elias and Vera found themselves swept up in something much larger than they'd anticipated. We don't have to go, Vera said one night as they lay in bed, unable to sleep. Cross has his marshals. Brennan's given them everything they need. We could stay here, let them handle it. Could you? Elias asked. Really? Vera was quiet for a long moment. No, I need to see this through. Fisk is the one who's been orchestrating all of this, the raids, the weapons, the destruction. If we don't stop him now, he'll just set up somewhere else and start again. Then we go together. Elias, this is going to be dangerous. More dangerous than Devil's Gate. There will be professional killers protecting those weapons. People who won't hesitate to shoot first and won't care that you're not really a gunfighter. I know. Elias rolled over to face her. But I also know that I can't let you ride into that kind of danger alone. We're partners now, for better or worse. That means we face things together. That's either very brave or very stupid. Can it be both? Vera laughed quietly in the darkness. I suppose it can. She reached for his hand, laced her fingers through his. Just promise me something. If shooting starts, you keep your head down and you don't try to be a hero. You've already proven yourself. You don't have anything left to prove. Same goes for you. I'm not the one who rushes into burning buildings and tackles armed men. No, you're just the one who infiltrates smuggling operations and faces down killers with nothing but nerve and a rifle. Elias squeezed her hand. We're both reckless in our own ways. Let's just try to be reckless together and survive it. Deal. They rode out 3 days later, a force of 12 marshals plus Elias, Vera, and Brennan. Cross led the expedition, pushing them hard across rough country that grew steadily more hostile and isolated. They traveled through territory where settlements were few and far between, where the law was whatever men with guns decided it should be. Prescott Ridge appeared on the 5th day, a small cluster of buildings tucked into a valley between two ridges of broken rock. It was even smaller than Holloway Station, maybe 20 structures in total, housing perhaps 50 people. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business and strangers were noted immediately. Cross sent 2 marshals into town posing as travelers, with instructions to quietly spread word of an imminent raid and suggest that families might want to visit relatives elsewhere for a few days. It was thin cover, but it was the best they could do without alerting Fisk's people to the trap being set. Over the next 2 days, families trickled out of Prescott Ridge in ones and twos. Some were clearly suspicious, others seemed almost relieved to have an excuse to leave. By the 3rd day, the settlement was nearly empty. Just a handful of stubborn residents who refused to be moved, and a few of Cross's marshals posing as ordinary citizens. And then they waited. The tension was unbearable. Elias spent his time checking and rechecking his medical supplies, preparing for the casualties he knew were coming. Vera cleaned her rifle obsessively, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The marshals maintained their positions in the rocks surrounding the settlement, invisible from below but with clear lines of sight to every approach. Brennan was the most nervous of all. He chain-smoked hand-rolled cigarettes and jumped at every sound, clearly expecting at any moment to be discovered and killed. Elias found himself feeling an unexpected sympathy for the man. Brennan had made terrible choices, participated in an operation that had killed innocent people, but he was trying to make it right, trying to stop the cycle of violence he'd helped perpetuate. That took a different kind of courage than Elias had shown. Not the courage of ignorance rushing into danger, but the harder courage of knowledge choosing redemption, despite the cost. The wagons arrived on the morning of the 7th day. There were 5 of them, heavily loaded, moving in tight formation with armed outriders visible on all sides. Elias watched from his position in the rocks above town, his heart hammering against his ribs. Even from this distance, he could see the lead rider's posture, the way he sat his horse with casual arrogance. Clayton Fisk, the man who'd cheated him, who'd profited from death, who'd built an empire on the suffering of frontier families. Seeing him now, Elias felt anger burn through the fear, a clean, righteous rage that steadied his hands and cleared his mind. "Easy," Vera murmured beside him. "Stay calm. Let Cross make the first move." The wagons rolled into the center of Prescott Ridge and stopped. Fisk dismounted, looking around with obvious satisfaction. He called out orders to his men, who began unloading crates with practiced efficiency. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned, from Fisk's perspective. What he didn't know was that he was surrounded by federal marshals with rifles trained on every member of his crew. Cross gave the signal. Marshals appeared from hiding positions all around the settlement, their weapons ready, their voices sharp with command. "Federal marshals! Everyone on the ground! Hands where we can see them!" For one frozen instant, Fisk's men stood paralyzed. Then someone made the catastrophic decision to reach for a gun. The settlement erupted in gunfire. Elias dropped flat behind the rocks as bullets whined overhead. Beside him, Vera was already returning fire, her rifle cracking with measured precision. Below, in the chaos of smoke and noise and confusion, men were running, shooting, dying. Cross's plan had been for overwhelming force to prevent exactly this outcome. But plans, Elias was learning, rarely survived contact with desperate men who had nothing to lose. "Stay down!" Vera shouted over the din. She fired again, and one of Fisk's men dropped his rifle and clutched his shoulder. "Don't move from this position." But Elias wasn't looking at the firefight. He was looking at the building at the edge of town, the one where he'd seen smoke beginning to curl from beneath the door. One of the stubborn residents who'd refused to evacuate was still inside, and in the chaos of the fight, a lamp or candle must have been knocked over. The building was catching fire. "Vera." He grabbed her arm, pointed. She looked, and her face went pale. "No, Elias, no. You stay here. I'll get them out." "You're needed here. You're the only one who can actually shoot." He was already moving, scrambling down from the rocks before she could stop him. "Just cover me." He ran. The world narrowed to the distance between him and that burning building, to the smoke that was growing thicker by the second, to the knowledge that someone was inside and would die if he didn't reach them in time. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet. Someone shouted his name. Vera's rifle cracked again and again, laying down covering fire that probably saved his life 3 times over. Elias hit the building's door at a full run, shouldering it open, and smoke billowed out in a choking wave. He pulled his bandana over his mouth and nose and plunged inside. The interior was a hell of heat and darkness. Flames climbed the walls, consuming old wood with terrifying speed. Through the smoke, Elias saw movement, a figure hunched in the corner, an elderly man who'd collapsed trying to escape. Elias crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbed the man under the arms, and dragged him toward the door. The old man was heavier than he looked, dead weight in Elias's arms. The heat was incredible, searing Elias's lungs with every breath. His eyes streamed tears, his vision blurred. 10 feet to the door, 5 feet, 3. The roof beam above them cracked with a sound like a cannon shot. Elias threw himself forward, pulling the old man with him, and they tumbled through the doorway in a tangle of limbs as the beam crashed down behind them, sending up a shower of sparks and burning debris. Hands grabbed Elias, pulled him clear. Someone was pouring water over him, over the old man. Through the ringing in his ears and the smoke-induced haze, Elias heard voices shouting orders, heard the gunfire that had temporarily ceased resume with renewed intensity. "You absolute idiot!" Vera's voice, harsh with fear and relief. "You could have died!" He was inside, had to... Elias couldn't seem to form complete sentences. His lungs burned. His throat felt like he'd swallowed broken glass. "I know. I saw." Her hands were on his face, checking for injuries with professional efficiency despite the tremor in her fingers. "You're an idiot. A brave idiot, but an idiot." The old man Elias had saved was coughing but conscious, already being tended to by one of the marshals who had basic medical training. Elias watched through streaming eyes as the man gave a shaky thumbs up and felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. He'd done it, saved someone. Not through shooting or tactics or anything he'd pretended to know, but through the simple act of running toward danger when everyone else ran away. Maybe that was enough. The firefight was winding down. Most of Fisk's men had surrendered when it became clear they were outnumbered and outgunned. A few had made a run for it and been captured by marshals positioned on the escape routes. Bodies lay in the street, 3 of Fisk's crew who'd chosen to fight to the end rather than face prison. And in the center of it all, kneeling with his hands bound behind his back, was Clayton Fisk. Marshal Cross approached him, his face hard as stone. "Clayton Fisk, you're under arrest for weapons smuggling, conspiracy to commit murder, treason, and about a dozen other charges I'll enjoy listing in detail when we get you to Fort Collins." Fisk spat blood onto the dirt. "You think this changes anything? You got me, you got my crew, but the network's bigger than you can imagine. There are a dozen others ready to step into my place. You haven't won, you've just inconvenienced us." "Maybe." Cross gestured, and 2 marshals hauled Fisk to his feet. "But you'll spend the rest of your life in prison watching those dozen others get caught one by one. Because people like Dr. and Mrs. Mercer, they're not stopping. They're going to keep fighting, and eventually your whole rotten network is going to collapse." Fisk's eyes found Elias across the settlement. Recognition flared, followed by something that might have been respect or might have been hatred. "The dentist," he said. "You were nothing. A mark. Easy money." "I was a mark," Elias agreed, his voice raw from smoke. "But I learned. And every person you cheat, every family you hurt, every settlement you destroy, some of them learn too. Some of them fight back. And that's what's going to destroy you in the end. Not federal marshals or fancy operations. Just ordinary people who get tired of being victims." "Poetic." Fisk smiled without humor. "Let's see how poetic you feel in 10 years when you're still chasing ghosts and the frontier's still bleeding." They took him away, loading him into a wagon with the other prisoners. The captured rifles, all 100 of them, were secured and inventoried. The settlement's remaining residents emerged cautiously from hiding, surveying the damage with shell-shocked expressions. And Elias sat on a porch step, his lungs still burning, watching the sun sink toward the western horizon, while Vera bandaged a cut on his forehead he didn't remember receiving. "You scared me," she said quietly. "I scared myself." "That's twice now you've run into burning buildings. You're developing a pattern. Only when there's someone inside who needs help." Elias winced as she pulled the bandage tight. "I'm not brave, Vera. I'm just too stubborn to walk away when I know I could do something." That's the definition of brave, you idiot. She tied off the bandage and sat down beside him. You know what's going to happen now, don't you? What? They're going to tell the story of how you saved that old man, how you charged through gunfire into a burning building while everyone else was fighting. And in the telling, it's going to get bigger and more dramatic until you're some kind of legend again. Let them. Elias was too tired to care anymore. I know the truth. You know the truth. That's enough. Is it? He thought about that, about legends and lies, about reputation and reality, about the gap between who people thought he was and who he actually was. For weeks, that gap had terrified him, had felt like a weight he couldn't carry. But somewhere between Devil's Gate and this burning settlement, between admitting the truth in court and running into danger anyway, the weight had shifted. The gap was still there. It would probably always be there. But it no longer felt like fraud. It felt like aspiration, like something to grow into rather than something to hide from. Yeah, he said finally. It is. Marshal Cross approached, his expression weary but satisfied. We got them all. Every member of Fisk's crew, all the weapons, and enough evidence to dismantle the entire network. This is a significant victory for the territory. What happens now? Vera asked. Now, we transport the prisoners back to Fort Collins for trial. Document everything. Start tracking down the other members of the organization. Cross paused. And I'd very much like you both to be part of that process. Not as full-time agents, I understand that's not what you want, but as consultants. People we can call on when we need your particular skills and perspective. Particular skills, Elias repeated. You mean my talent for stumbling into danger and Vera's talent for getting us back out alive? Among other things, Cross's smile was genuine. You make a good team. You balance each other. And you have something a lot of lawmen lack. You actually give a damn about the people you're protecting. That matters out here. That makes all the difference. Vera looked at Elias, a question in her eyes. He nodded slightly. We'll do it, she said, on our terms. We maintain our independence, we choose which cases we take, and we base ourselves in Fort Collins, where Dr. Mercer can establish his practice. But when you need us, we'll be there. That's all I can ask. Cross extended his hand and they shook on it. Welcome to the fight. It's going to be long and messy and probably never ending, but it's worth it. The journey back to Fort Collins took 8 days. They traveled slowly, hindered by prisoners and wounded, stopping frequently to rest the horses and allow Elias to check on the injuries sustained during the firefight. 3 marshals had been wounded, none seriously. The old man Elias had saved rode in one of the wagons, insisting every few hours on thanking his rescuer until Elias was thoroughly embarrassed. Brennan rode with them, quieter now, the weight of his testimony and the knowledge of what he'd helped destroy settling on his shoulders. Elias talked with him several times during the journey, long conversations about guilt and redemption and whether a man could ever truly atone for past mistakes. I don't know if I can, Brennan said on the 6th night. Make up for what I did. The people who died because of weapons I helped move. I can't bring them back. No, Elias agreed. But you can make sure it doesn't keep happening. You can use what you know to stop others from making the same choices. That's not nothing. It's not enough. Maybe not, but it's a start. Elias stared into the fire. I spent my whole life thinking I had to be perfect, had to meet every expectation, had to never make mistakes. Coming out here taught me that's impossible. We all fail. We all fall short. The question is what we do after. Do we keep failing, or do we try to do better? Brennan was quiet for a long moment. You really believe that? That someone like me can do better? I have to believe it. Because if I don't, then what's the point of any of this? Elias looked at him directly. You came forward when you didn't have to. You risked everything to stop Fisk. That counts for something. Maybe not enough to erase the past, but enough to start building a different future. When they finally reached Fort Collins, the town turned out to meet them. Word had spread about the raid, about the captured weapons, about the dismantling of Fisk's operation. People lined the streets, cheering and calling out thanks. Children ran alongside the wagons. Women waved from doorways. Elias felt profoundly uncomfortable with all of it. They're celebrating us, he muttered to Vera. We don't deserve this. We stopped 100 rifles from starting a war. I'd say we deserve at least a little celebration." She waved to the crowd, looking almost as uncomfortable as he felt. "Just smile and wave. It'll be over soon." But it wasn't over soon. The celebration continued for days. The newspaper ran stories about the heroic dentist and his sharpshooter wife. The territorial governor sent a letter of commendation. Samuel Garrett, who'd arrived in town with another wagon train, bought them dinner and told everyone who would listen about how he'd known from the start they were special. Through it all, Elias and Vera maintained a careful balance between graciousness and honesty. They accepted thanks but deflected praise. They acknowledged their role but emphasized the work of the marshals, Brennan's courage in coming forward, the cooperation of the community. They tried in every way they could to make the story about something bigger than themselves. And slowly, gradually, the fervor began to die down. People returned to their ordinary lives. The celebration faded into memory. Fort Collins settled back into its regular rhythms, which gave Elias and Vera the space to start building something of their own. They found a property on the main street, a small building that had served as a general store before the owner retired. The front room was perfect for a dental practice, with good light from large windows and enough space for proper equipment. The back rooms could serve as living quarters until they could afford something larger. Elias hung his shingle 3 weeks after their return. The sign was simple, hand-painted by a local artist. Dr. Elias Mercer, dental surgeon. Below it, in smaller letters, "All patients welcome. No one turned away for inability to pay." His first patient was Sarah Colton. She'd been placed with the family in Fort Collins. Good people who'd lost their own daughter to fever and welcomed Sarah into their home with open arms. But she'd insisted on waiting for Dr. Mercer to open his practice before having her teeth examined, despite the fact that several other dentists had offered their services. "You saved me," she said simply, when Elias asked why she'd waited. "Back at the settlement, you came into that cellar when you could have left me there. I trust you." Elias had to turn away for a moment, his throat tight. When he'd composed himself, he examined her teeth with gentle thoroughness, explained what work needed to be done, and scheduled her first appointment. She left with a smile that was still haunted but beginning to heal. Other patients followed. Families from the wagon train who remembered how he'd treated Peters's shoulder wound. Locals who'd heard about his work during the raid on Prescott Ridge. People who simply needed a dentist and found in Elias someone who treated them with respect and genuine care. The practice grew slowly but steadily. Elias found that he loved the work in ways he'd never loved it back in Boston. Here, every patient was a person with a story, a life, struggles and triumphs that mattered. He wasn't just pulling teeth or filling cavities. He was part of a community, woven into the fabric of people's lives in a way he'd never experienced before. And Vera found her own place in that community. She didn't hang a shingle or advertise her services. She didn't need to. Word spread that Mrs. Mercer had certain skills, that she could track missing persons or recover stolen property, that she knew how to handle situations that required both discretion and competence. People came to her with problems they couldn't take to the regular law, domestic situations, property disputes, cases that fell through the cracks of official justice. She took the cases that interested her and turned away the ones that didn't. She maintained her independence fiercely, working with Marshal Cross when their goals aligned and ignoring him when they didn't. And she always came home to the small building on the main street where Elias pulled teeth and tried to bring a little order to the chaos of frontier life. They settled into a rhythm that felt, if not quite natural, then at least sustainable. Elias worked his practice during the day while Vera took on investigations or trained with her rifle at the range outside town. Evenings they spent together, sharing meals and conversation, comparing notes on their respective days. Some nights Vera would disappear on a case that required travel, and Elias would wake alone, trying not to worry. Other times they'd work together on situations that needed both medical expertise and investigative skill. It wasn't the life either of them had imagined, but it was the life they'd built together, piece by piece, choice by choice. And somehow, that made it better than any imagined future could have been. 6 months after the raid on Prescott Ridge, Marshal Cross appeared at their door with another case. A settlement northwest of Fort Collins had gone silent, and there were fears of another weapons smuggling operation, or worse. I need people I can trust, Cross said. People who understand the stakes and won't back down when things get difficult. Will you help? Elias looked at Vera. She looked back, a question in her eyes. Together? She asked. Together, he confirmed. They rode out the next morning, leaving the practice in the capable hands of a young dental student Elias had been training. The settlement turned out to be dealing with a water dispute rather than weapons smuggling, but their presence helped broker a peace that might otherwise have escalated into violence. They returned to Fort Collins a week later, tired but satisfied. And life continued. Cases came and went. Some were dangerous, requiring all of Vera's skill and Elias's growing ability to think on his feet. Others were mundane, easily resolved with conversation and common sense. Through them all, Elias kept his practice running, kept serving the community, kept building the life he'd come west to find. People still called him a hero sometimes, still told stories about the legendary dentist who could fight as well as he could heal. Elias had stopped correcting them. The truth was complicated. He was neither the incompetent fool he'd believed himself to be, nor the fearless gunfighter of frontier legend. He was something in between, something messier and more human. A man who'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And Vera, who'd spent years running from her past and burying herself in the pursuit of justice, was learning to stay still, to build something that lasted beyond the next case, to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved the peace she'd fought so hard to create for others. On a cool evening in early autumn, as they sat on the porch of their building watching Fort Collins settle into twilight, Vera reached over and took Elias's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Coming west? Marrying a stranger? Getting pulled into a life you never planned?" Elias thought about that question, about the frightened young man who'd stepped off the stagecoach in Holloway Station, full of grand dreams and crushing self-doubt. About the journey that had broken him down and rebuilt him into something stronger. About the woman beside him who'd shown him what real courage looked like. "No," he said finally. "I don't regret any of it, even the terrifying parts, maybe especially the terrifying parts." "Why?" "Because I came west thinking I needed to bring civilization to the frontier. But what I learned is that the frontier doesn't need civilizing. It needs people willing to stand their ground, to fight for what's right, to build something good in a place that's trying very hard to destroy them." He squeezed her hand, and I learned that I could be one of those people. Not because I'm naturally brave or talented or special, but because I chose to try. Because you believed I could before I believed it myself. Vera was quiet for a long moment. "You know what the strangest part is?" "What?" "I came to that wagon train planning to use you and discard you. A means to an end, nothing more. I never expected—" She paused, searching for words. "I never expected you to matter, to become someone I couldn't imagine living without." "Is that your way of saying you love me?" "Don't push your luck, Dr. Mercer." But she was smiling, and her hand was warm in his, and when she leaned her head against his shoulder, Elias felt something settle deep in his chest, a sense of rightness, of belonging, of home. The frontier spread out before them, vast and dangerous and full of possibilities. There would be more cases, more challenges, more moments of fear and triumph, and desperate improvisation. The work Cross had described, long and messy and never-ending, would continue, but they would face it together. The dentist who'd learned to be brave and the operative who'd learned to stay. Partners in every sense of the word, building a life and a legacy, one choice at a time. In the distance, someone started playing a fiddle. The music drifted through the cooling air, a melody that spoke of hope and hardship, of loss and renewal, of the stubborn human insistence on finding joy even in the hardest places. Elias closed his eyes and listened, Vera warm beside him, Fort Collins settling into its evening rhythms around them. He'd come west to matter, to prove himself, to escape the limitations of his old life. He'd found all of that and more, not in the ways he'd expected, but in ways that turned out to be infinitely better. The frontier had tested him, broken him, reshaped him. It had taken his lies and forced him to make them true. It had given him a wife who was his equal and his opposite, who challenged him and steadied him in equal measure. And in return, he'd given it everything he had. His courage, such as it was, his skill with healing, his stubborn refusal to run when running would be easier. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything the frontier had needed him to be, and everything he'd needed to become. The music played on, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. And Elias Mercer, former timid dentist from Boston, current unlikely hero of the territories, sat on his porch beside the woman he loved and felt, for the first time in his life, completely at peace with who he'd become. The end.